Blood dripped down the blade and fell into the soil. Zhang Zhilau clenched the Ling Xiao sword, and the knuckles of his fingers were almost exhausted and shattered, and bruises were cracked in the movement of his fingers. He has not noticed any residual spiritual power in his body. What I can see is the bright red that spreads and slips from the Ling Xiao sword, dyeing the land of Shenzhou red inch by inch. Zhang Zhilau propped up his body. The meridians in his body have long been crushed by the impact of the boundary membrane, and now he can stand with his sword, but it is only half a step to maintain the realm of Jingxian. The aura that was continuously extracted from the sky and the earth stopped immediately after the boundary membrane was repaired. The sky is covered with thick clouds, and the setting sun is like blood. Zhang Zhilau closed his eyes, the darkness in front of him calmed down, he paused for a moment, then opened it again, drew his sword, turned around, and put the Ling Xiao sword into the sheath. The Ling Xiao sword is the sword of the head of the Ling Xiao faction, and it is also a symbol of the highest power of the Ling Xiao faction. It crouched low in Zhang Zhilau's palm, uttering a deep tremor and a low cry, but then it was suddenly silent, and there was no sound. When Zhang Zhilau turned around, the clouds in the sky spread and expanded behind him, and the radiance of the setting sun dyed the clouds, which was unparalleled, and his long black hair, which was like ink, turned into snow, which was obviously a loose and ethereal fairy robe. But it shows an extreme thinness. The boundary membrane was repaired again, and the catastrophe that Shenzhou would face has disappeared in his palm. Zhu Yuxin stood not far away and looked at him. He looked at the long white hair of his senior brother Shenzhou, freed from the restraint of the hair crown, and was blown by the wind in his ears, and watched the blood dripping on his robe that was never stained with dust, gradually expanding and becoming dazzling. Of bright red. He watched Zhang Zhilau put away his sword, and looked at the clouds behind him, as if heaven and earth were bidding farewell to him. Zhu Yuxin didn't know if he was going to die. He stared at Ling Xiaojian. At the same time, he is watching this senior brother who has been pressing him for more than 1,000 years. Zhang Zhilau wanted to suppress the meridians that were agitating and scurrying around in the body, and calmly asked Zhu Yuxin, but he couldn't suppress it. After only 2 steps, he was stopped by the pain of the 5 internal organs, and stopped for a moment while holding the scabbard. The sweetness crept across the corners of his lips. I wish Yuxin didn't come to help him. However, Zhang Zhilau didn't need these. The more broken and fragile he was, the more he could feel a distinct sense of relief. If it wasn't too painful, he might still be able to smile at his junior brother now, and then entrust him with the Ling Xiao faction. It's just a matter of returning to the original owner. Zhang Zhilau thought. The first head of the Ling Xiao faction, Zhu Wenyuan, was Yuxin's biological father. He is just a disciple of Wen Yuan's mentor, and the younger brother in front of him is the one who has passed down the blood. Zhang Zhilau walked up to the younger brother. Clouds and mists are surging, waning clouds are covered, and the surging aura is revived. Above the peak that was originally silent as death, it is revived at this moment, and the buds are drawn from the cracks under the feet, and everything is renewed. Zhang Zhilau avoided the new grass sprout under his feet and handed Ling Xiaojian to him. Senior brother, Zhu Yuxin took the sword and looked around him, saying, "Why do you have to act alone, if there is someone else to help? The boundary membrane of the Great Thousand World can only be touched by a half-step Jingxian. Can you still find the second one in the cultivation world?" Zhang Zhilau's voice was the same as before, always cold and indifferent, with almost no emotion. He was cold and indifferent, as if to everyone. Zhu Yuxin's hand holding the sword clenched tightly, and the phalanx was slightly pale. He took a deep breath and said, "Even at this time, senior brother still refuses to say a word to me." Zhu Yuxin raised his eyes and looked over, looking at his slightly tired brows. He couldn't find a trace of affection, nor could he find any trace of remorse or dissatisfaction from the other party, only the calm like a deep pool remained. With icy. Even by this time, Zhang Zhilau didn't have any spiritual energy, just raised his hand to kill him. Ling Xiaojian was already in his hands, and since then, in front of Zhu Yuxin, there has never been such a senior brother pressed on his head. But even at this time, Zhang Zhilau was still so arrogant. Is there a place for senior brother? Zhu Yuxin is unwilling to keep him. His prestige in the Ling Xiao faction and even in the entire cultivation world is too strong. For thousands of years, he is recognized as the leader of the Immortal Gate and Immortal Venerable Ling Xiao. If Zhang Zhilau is kept in the door, even a crippled person who is covered in pain may have a position that is difficult to move. Zhang Zhilau knew what Zhu Yuxin was thinking. He turned his head and glanced at Kangxia. After a while, he said, "Go to Zongnan Mountain." It was the place where Ling Xiaoxian's head was buried. It was extremely remote, far away from people, and there were many little monsters, so it seemed that it was not suitable for living. Zongnan Mountain. Zhu Yuxin repeated this place, looking at his snow-white hair, suddenly raised his hand, wiped the wet blood from the other's lips, and smiled, "It's a good place, you can let senior brother recuperate in peace." The pulp of the finger lightly brushed the corner of his lips, with a softness different from his temperament. Rehabilitation. Zhang Zhilau avoided this move and said, "To die before Master's tombstone, can he live up to his dying request?" Zhang Zhilau looked at him, saw the twinkling stars in his younger brother's eyes, and said, "Now that I'm leaving, you take care of the Ling Xiao faction. No one can restrain you and teach you." Although he didn't have emotions when he said this, the pain of the 5 internal organs in his body being almost broken was lingering. Zhang Zhilau coughed, and the blood stained his lips again. He didn't care, and continued, "If someone bullies you in the future, senior brother won't be here anymore." Zhu Yuxin choked, and stared at his face for a moment. "You don't have to come to find me," Zhang Zhilau said, "there is no need to tell everyone. Being able to return to Mount Zongnan is my last hope in the endless years." Zhu Yuxin suddenly didn't know what to say. Before Zhang Zhilau said these words, he had imagined various scenarios. In his heart, his brother Zhang would always make rapid progress and be omnipotent, and would always be the best at fulfilling his father's entrustment and protecting the world's souls. He never thought that Zhang Zhilau would be stunned by the catastrophe in front of him. He lived in the shadow of his brother, but he didn't realize that he was also living under his brother's wings. It is precisely because of this kind of trust that he did not do his best to assist his senior brother. Zhu Yuxin almost never took it as his fault, because he knew that senior brother could definitely do it. There is nothing in this world that senior brother can't do. But he didn't expect that Zhang Zhilau fell ill, was seriously injured, and the blood was not removed, but he still said these words to him calmly. Zhu Yuxin was silent for a long time. His mind was in chaos. He was thinking that his brother had given him the power of the Ling Xiao faction without reservation. Taking over Ling Xiaojian, he didn't teach him how to help him. Zhu Yuxin knew that all these things could not escape his eyes, but Zhang Zhilau didn't mention it. The sect master sword in his palm was hot for no reason. Zhang Zhilau continued, "The method of coexisting with demons, whether it is to follow my old rules or establish new rules, the junior and senior brothers will handle it themselves. It's just coming." Zhu Yuxin was a little nervous, and when he finally waited for the other party's request, he looked condensed and listened intently. "It's just that I have a lot of little demons under my door." Zhang Zhilau was silent for a moment, then continued, "Let's go." Zhu Yuxin looked at him blankly. He saw his brother's blood-stained sleeves, and when he covered his lips and coughed lightly, the blood clots spit out from his internal organs congealed on the top. The head of the immortal path, who used to be strong and unparalleled, now looks like a very fragile one in front of him. The colored glazed cup made Zhu Yuxin dare not touch it. Zhang Zhilau closed his eyes, relieved the dizziness in his mind, and then took a step forward, as if he wanted to leave. This step was not stable, and he stumbled a little, but at the next moment, Zhu Yuxin caught him and steadied his arm. "Senior brother, wait a second." Zhu Yuxin suddenly felt that he was about to lose something, and was a little flustered for no reason. The repair of the boundary membrane of the Great Thousand World, all factions should know immediately, and they will come to Ling Xiao faction soon. Thank you, brother, brother. The hand he was supporting was slowly pushed away, and his senior brother was just as he had imagined. After any disaster, he could stand in front of him without any disturbance, as if he was born strong and tenacious, and would not let anyone get on him. Pick out weaknesses. But not this time. Zhang Jilayu is too tired. He swallowed a mouthful of blood and went back, not knowing how long this broken and empty body could last under such serious injuries. But he didn't care either. His burden for more than 1,000 years was finally relieved. Zhang Jilayu was too happy to be happy. He glanced at Zhu Yuxin one last time. Junior brother, cherish it. Zhu Yuxin was speechless for a while, only the Ling Xiaojian by his hand vibrated violently, as if he wanted to let go and follow him. Zhu Yuxin grasped the scabbard in his palm tightly, his heart suddenly sobered up. He raised his hand and saluted, "Senior brother, I will go far, I." "You don't have to send it." Zhang Jilayu gave a rare smile. "Go back. Clouds cover the sky, and the setting sun sinks into Zishan." Zhu Yuxin watched him leave. The corners of his clothes were covered with blood, and when he saw the unmatched senior brother in his heart, a trace of delicacy was drawn from his parting figure. He hadn't found out for so many years that Zhang Ziliu was so thin, whether it was his shoulders, waist, or fingers when wiping blood stains, all of them were blown away like a gust of wind, and he could never find a place to disappear into the world. Zhu Yuxin stood for a long time before he regained his sense of reality from the Ling Xiao sword in his hand. No one can stop him anymore. All the shadows that have been under people for a long time, the jealousy of the position of the head, have all turned into nothingness, and no one will discipline him harshly anymore. He doesn't have a brother anymore. The lingering rays of the sun were all over, and then came the rare snowfall. On the way sent by Ling Xiao to Mount Zongnan, everything he experienced was bitter cold and heavy snow, and there was no one on the road. The night was dark, and a lamp was hung in front of the carriage, which swayed freely in the snowy night. There was a coachman in the carriage, a mortal hired with silver, and the carriage was also hired with money. Zhang Jilayu, who has been the head of the immortal Dao for so many years, is often only called senior immortal by others, and rarely uses silver money, so he doesn't know what price to give. The price is driven by the driver. The driver is a relative of the disciple of Ling Xiao sect. He was picked up from Ling Xiao sect. Even if he didn't know Zhang Ziliu, he would not dare to covet property or do wrong things. The chandelier swayed on the eaves of the carriage. The driver stopped the horse, and said to the inside, "The place you want to go is about to arrive. There is only a section of road ahead that the carriage can go, and then you have to go up the mountain. There are many monsters in the mountains, the old man really dare not." Zhang Jilayu responded, and then asked, "What time is it now?" "It's almost time." At this time, all the sects must have known about the repair of the boundary membrane, and they all went to the Ling Xiao faction. Zhang Jilayu's old habits are hard to change, and he thought about the sect at the first time, but this time, he didn't have any worries or far-reaching plans in the past. After walking for a while, we arrived at Zongnan Mountain. The carriage stopped, the driver put down the stool, and when he got up and looked up, he happened to see a hand pulling the curtain of the car, with slender knuckles and round nails, but no blood, almost like a beautiful jade carving. The driver held his breath subconsciously and saw that this young man had a very heavy plush cape on his body, his long snow-colored hair was only half-tied, his face was handsome and cold, his eyes were dark, and he could not see any brilliance inside. The icy wind and snow made people almost want to retreat. The driver felt that the wind and snow in the sky did not look colder than this young man. But when he helped the other party, he felt that the young man was unstable and weak, as if he was only breathing. "Thank you." Zhang Jilayu paid him the rest of the fare, then looked up at the familiar Yamagata. In the past, when Master passed away, he and his younger brother were buried here. On his deathbed, Master entrusted him to take care of Ling Xiao faction and Wuxin. Now, his mission has been completed, his cultivation base has been completely destroyed, and he is no different from a cripple. He can finally go up the mountain to live in seclusion, which can be regarded as a long-term and old age. The Ling Xiao faction, the cultivation world, and all beings above Shenzhou no longer need him. Zhang Jialiu stretched out his hand to wrap the cape on his shoulders and stepped on the thick snow on the ground. For the first time since he began to practice Taoism, he re-experienced the coldness of the world like today. Zhang Jialiu walked across the snow until the snow-covered tombstone. He knelt down, stretched out his hand to dry the white snow on the monument, and looked at the writing on the monument for a long time. There were countless things to say, but he didn't know where to start. Zhang Jialiu was an orphan since he was a child. When he was 3 years old, he was brought back to the Ling Xiao school by Zhu Wenyuan. From then on, his teacher was his parents, and Ling Xiao Xianmen was his hometown. The moonlight shone slowly. Zhang Jialiu thought about it for a long time, and then said softly, "Wuxin has grown up. He says, I'm here to accompany you." Ling Xiao faction. The whole place is full of the pillars and mainstays of the current world, but the atmosphere is condensed like magma, making it hard to breathe. Zhu Wuxin sat in the head and told everyone about Zhang Jialiu's departure, and then he kept playing with Jian Suier of Ling Xiaojian, waiting for an answer. The silence grew tense. Until finally someone couldn't help it, slapped the sword on the case, got up and scolded, "Xianzun is injured so much, you dare to let him go, you are not doing it all in your heart, you are fighting for power and position, and you are not allowed to be senior brother." The more Jin Yuja cursed, the more anger he felt. He took back the Sevayen star sword that was slapped on the table, pointed at Zhu Wuxin, and said coldly, "Senior is so generous, I can't repay it. The Ling Xiao faction doesn't raise seniors, I raise them." No one who followed him dared to persuade him. Only one person in the seat shook the folding fan and faintly agreed, "There is no need for your peerless sword pavilion to compete. With Wang Wenyuan here, Tianji Pavilion should welcome Immortal Venerable back and cultivate and heal carefully." Jin Yuja was too lazy to care about this magic stick, and stared straight at Zhu Wuxin with a pair of tiger eyes, and said, "Senior Zhang protects Ling Xiao and destroys his cultivation in order to save the world, and he still won't get a good end. You, junior brother, still have one point. Conscience, just tell me where Immortal Venerable is, and I will pick it up naturally." Zhu Wuxin slowly clenched the long sword in his palm and hooked his lower lip. "Although my brother has no cultivation, he can be regarded as the most learned person in the world of self-cultivation. Pavilion Master Jin is really thinking of my brother when he said this." His brows froze, and his words became even colder. "The Ling Xiao faction has paved the way for all beings in the world. You don't want to repay, but slander me. This sword was handed over to me by my senior brother, and the young pavilion master really wants to be the one who gives the sword, can't it? The Ling Xiao sword was handed down by the head of Ling Xiao in all dynasties. Only by wearing the Ling Xiao sword can others be called Ling Xiao Zhenjun. Treasures have souls, and naturally they will not remain in the hands of those who rob them." Jin Yuja was not afraid of him, but was concerned about his status as a junior brother of Zhang Jialiu. Killing him made Zhang Ziliu unhappy. He was so angry that he slashed into the ground with a sword and said, "When I find Immortal Venerable, if you stay senior is a little mean, I will kill your head immediately." The ground was made of black iron mixed with cold stone, which was extremely hard. It was still cracked by the 7-star sword, and the cracks were densely penetrated and cracked, like a spider web. Jin Yuja immediately drew his sword, turned around and left. The unparalleled sword pavilion monks who were behind Hexi and thanked him also turned into murderous aura and left the Ling Xiao faction. Except for Wushu and Jianzhi, the other factions were also not satisfied with such a result, but they were not as impulsive as Jin Yuja, who was young and vigorous, and was greatly favored by Zhang Jialiu, so naturally they could not bear it. With the departure of Wushu and Jianzhi, the other factions also left one by one. Only Wang Wenyuan of Tianji Pavilion was still in the same place, waving the fan in his hand at will. The pavilion master won't leave. Zhu Yuxin stood up slowly. I want to ask the sect master again, where is the immortal venerable? Zhu Yuxin has been suppressed for a long time, and his mood is even worse at this moment, and he said coldly, where is my senior brother going? Do I still need to inform all immortal friends? This is a matter of our Ling Xiao faction, and I advise you not to interfere. What's more, I senior brother doesn't like being disturbed by others. There is no other meaning. Wang Wenyuan stopped shaking the fan and said, I look at Shenzhou, and this catastrophe does not seem to have really passed. Zhu Yuxin made a move, and even his eyes stopped. What did you say? But my senior brother has clearly. Hey, Wang Wenyuan got up to leave, and said lazily, maybe the loss of Zhang Xianzun is the real beginning of this so-called catastrophe. He didn't say more, put away the folding fan in the cold night of heavy snow, glanced at the north thoughtfully, and then led the Taoist boy behind him to leave. Heavy snow fell into the temple. Zhu Yuxin stood where he was, watching the fine snowflakes melting on the temple, without saying a word for a while. Weather like this. Those who cultivate the Tao, once they build a foundation, do not know the cold and heat, but if their cultivation is destroyed, they do not know whether they will be invaded by the cold and heat and damage the body. Zhu Yuxin was fascinated for a long time, and when the disciple around him called, he suddenly came back to his senses and took a deep breath. This kind of weather really hurts the body. Zhang Jiliu Suezhong wiped the teacher's tombstone clean, feeling the chills in his body. He talked to his teacher for a while, and told him how the children who were raised at the time are now cultivated, and told him what Zhu Yuxin had done, and how the Ling Xiao faction became the leader of the 4 sections. He seldom said so much, and by the time he felt cold, another half a foot of snow had piled up. Zhang Jiliu stood up and turned to look at the thatched cottage built not far away when his teacher was buried. Although it is a grass hut, the material is not grass, but some common constructions in the world of self-cultivation. It is rare in the world. Although the house has fallen dust, it is not unbearable. Zhang Jiliu was really tired. He wanted to clean up the place tomorrow, so he just made some fires. He sat on the couch in the grass hut and stared at the fire for a while. His eyes were a little flowery, he subconsciously looked away, and saw a bunch of chaotic weeds, and a pitch-black snake in the grass. The little snake froze all over, as if he was also injured. The wound was dark red, and he looked only a little better than Zhang Ziliu. Zhang Jiliu thought for a while, then stretched out his hand to pull the little snake to the side of the fire, and roasted the fire with the snake on the ground. His cultivation base was completely destroyed, but his realm was still there. Although he lost the ability to resist the cold and heat, he was still able to fast. If such a serious injury does not die, and a long-term illness can be healed, the lifespan brought by the state will not be lost, but there is no magic at all. Zhang Jiliu is very clear about his physical condition. He can't die if he dies temporarily. He can live for a few years, not sure. But no matter how many years, it belongs to him alone. Halfway through thinking about it, he was tired and a little sleepy. He probably closed his eyes and rested for a while, when he suddenly heard a rustling sound in his ears. Zhang Jiliu frowned and raised his eyes, and saw that the fire was still burning, and there was a little monster with a wound sitting on the side of the little snake. The little demon was about 12 or 13 years old, and his demonic aura was not strong. Instead, there was an extremely impactful aura. Black hair and black pupils, looking at him in panic at this moment. It seems that Zhang Jiliu will kill him in the next moment. Zhang Jiliu stretched out his hand to add fire, but did not speak. After a while, the little demon asked timidly, "Where did the gods come from? I want to ask you." Zhang Jiliu took a branch and fiddled with Mars next to him. "Why are you here?" The little demon stayed for a while, then burst into tears, he smelled a very fragrant immortal energy on Zhang Ziliu, instinctively felt that someone with such a strong immortal energy would definitely not hurt him, so he snorted and said, "Someone wants to kill him." They got lost, I ran into this place and hid." Zhang Ziliu nodded and poked the fire again. "Why did you kill you? He often takes in little demons, there are many monsters under his door, and those little demons also say that he has an affinity for demons. It's just that I left the Ling Xiao faction, and I never saw it again." The little snake demon wiped away his tears and said, "My name is Chong Gan. I'm a half-demon." Chong Gan's eyes reddened from crying, and he said obediently, "My mother is a demon, and my father is a demon. The demon world does not allow half-demon to confuse the blood of the royal family. My brother gave an order, to kill me. Royal blood?" Zhang Ziliu glanced at him unexpectedly. In the demon world, there are two true monarchs of Qinglong and Vermilion, and there are major demon clans. It is not unusual that there are many snake demons with the surname Chong. But the blood of the royal family in the demon world is very precious. Zhang Ziliu said, "Who is your brother?" He didn't have a deep memory of the demon realm, because he didn't have much dealings with him. He only remembered that many years ago, the demon realm venerable master had led the children of the royal family to the Ling Xiao faction to meet, negotiated a contract, and never saw him again. Chong Gan said, "My brother is Wen Rengzi, and he is my half-brother. He wants to kill me behind his uncle's back." Zhang Ziliu nodded, still unable to sort out the grievances of their wealthy family, but calmly roasted his hands, closed his eyes with his chin up, and said, "If someone comes to kill you, keep your voice down and don't wake me up." Chong Gan was stunned for a while, and pointed to himself stupidly, and then pointed to the other party stupidly. Zhang Ziliu's hair was falling down, and the snow was white, but the fingertips were even whiter and colder than the hair. Even by the fire, the faint chill on his body was enough to stop him. What's more, there is still a smell on his body, and there is also a deep sense of sickness and bones, as if it will shatter at the touch of a touch. Chong Gan originally thought that Zhang Ziliu could save him, but after realizing that the other party also seemed to be injured, he settled down in his heart. He didn't know where the courage came from, and whispered, "I will run out, I won't cause you trouble." Zhang Ziliu did not move. The firewood burned, making a beeping sound. It was still snowing outside the house, and the snow blocked the mountain, making it even more difficult for ordinary people to go up the mountain, and there were some wild beasts howling outside. The moonlight poured into the window lattice and sprinkled on the feet. When it was almost dawn, Chong Qian woke up in a daze, not knowing when he fell asleep. He looked up and saw Zhang Ziliu sitting not far away, warming the wine on the burning fire. The wine seemed to be medicinal wine with a hint of bitterness. "God!" Chong Gan said cautiously, "What are you doing?" Zhang Ziliu tried the temperature, and said casually, "I soaked you for treatment." Chong Gan was stunned for a while, wondering if this was the other party's attempt to scare him, or if this icy immortal really wanted to catch himself making wine. What appeared in his mind for a while was not the first to be strong, but that he didn't know how to resist so as not to hurt him. After all, this ill beauty looks like she can fall down when pushed. If she resists too fiercely, she will probably hurt him. From the outside, this person looks like it is made of glass crystal, and it will be damaged if you are not careful. Chong Gan stayed for a while, and couldn't think of a reason, until the sunny day outside suddenly changed, and the snowstorm hit again. In the next moment, a few ferocious demons crashed in, smashed the door of the house into pieces, and roared, "Chang'an child, come out for me!" The demons chased and killed so far, and Chong Gan immediately stiffened and his face was pale. When he immediately planned to escape again, he found that the exit at the other end was also blocked, and both ends were approaching step by step. The demonic energy destroyed the window lattice, and the wind and snow that swept through it extinguished the sparks. Zhang Ziliu warmed the wine for a while, moved the wine over, and raised his eyes to look at the mighty demonic energy at the door. Chang'an, I'll kill today before the last word you could be said. The leading demons turned their eyes, and the words suddenly stopped, completely dumbfounded, and fell to the ground with a thud. He got up from the ground and stammered, Zhang 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 Zhang. Zhang Xianzun, me. I'm a good citizen, no, I'm a good demon, I. Zhang Zhiliu raised his eyebrows in surprise, you know me. Recognize. The more nervous the demons were, the more they said bad things, and said with a sad face, hundreds of years ago, I saw you with the Lord. Knowing that you are here, I don't have the courage to give me 800 years. Dare to enter, come in. If I had known you, you took him in, how dare I dare, how dare to mess around. Zhang Zhiliu didn't know whether the news that his cultivation base had been destroyed had reached the demon realm, so he responded casually, pointed to the door frame, and said, you crashed it for me. Tears of the demon race were about to fall, and he said heroically, Zhang Xianzun, I did this all by myself, you can let them go. The few young demons behind him also changed from prototypes to humanoids, from blue-faced fangs to young and nervous, one more youthful than the last. Seeing that he was about to cry, Zhang Zhiliu said lightly, fix the door for me, then you can leave. As the leader of the demon clan was granted amnesty, he was about to give Zhang Zhiliu a knock. He abruptly stood up, greeted the demon clan behind him, and began to get busy with a crackling. Chang'an, who was beside him, was stunned for a long time. He watched Zhang Zhiliu drink some medicinal wine, then went to fall asleep on the packed couch, and looked at the great demons who were busy decorating. What happened? After only half a candle incense, a small and simple house was rebuilt into a pine wood building with a two-story duplex structure. Even the furniture was knocked out several times. The table, reclining chairs, and bookcases with rolling shutters were all neat and tidy. The Mozu decoration team finished arranging, and did not dare to wake Xianzun, but glared at Chang'an fiercely, threw his sleeves angrily, and walked away quietly. Chang'an, hiss. It seems to be near a very special person. The big demon took the demons behind him out of Zongnan Mountain, and then began to chatter. The two young witches behind him whispered, that's Zhang Xianzun, why are you here in Zongnan Mountain? What do you know? This is the place where the last generation of true monarch Ling Xiao was buried, and the immortal venerable came to visit the spiritual position of his mentor. Chang'an, that little thing, how can I have such a good life? I also want to be taken in by immortal venerable. What are you thinking about? You are a demon. Zhang Xianzun likes demons but not demons, don't you know? I know, but I am. Okay. The big demon-headed cut off the conversation between the two behind him and said irritably, I can't catch up with Chang'an on this trip, and I can't explain it to Master Xi. Master Xi is just using chicken feathers as an arrow. Your lord didn't say that he would kill Chang'an. Your lord will at best ignore this person. This sentence seemed to remind the leading demon race. He touched his chin and said, Your lord is a half-step golden immortal, and Xianzun is also a half-step golden immortal. I heard that your lord has always wanted to meet Zhang Xianzun. It's just that immortal venerable's whereabouts are uncertain, so. Brother, what do you mean? Let's report to the Lord. The great demon made a final decision. With the power of our Lord, even if it is true monarch Ling Xiao in the first seat of Xianmen, I can definitely fight. Under the doubts in the eyes of the demons, the leader gritted his teeth and said, a draw. He had seen immortal venerable doing it, and he really didn't dare to boast. When the Lord was still the young lord of the devil world, he once asked Xianzun Zhang to fight, and then he was suppressed by a sword. And the sword wound was branded on the heart of the Lord, and it did not heal for a long time, forming a scar. When Zhang Ziliu woke up again, what he saw was the built pine wood building. The upper and lower floors are shielded by screens and shutters, and even the furniture is placed in a decent and thoughtful manner. The fire that ignited the fire before has been put out, and it was replaced by a copper magic weapon. As long as a little magic is added to it, it can burn roaringly and drive away the cold. Zhang Jiayu stared at the copper stove for a while, then looked down at his pale and bloodless palms. Not a trace of magic. He raised his eyes and saw Chang Gan with black hair and black eyes sorting things in the house, putting the white plums picked from the back of Zongnan Mountain into a porcelain vase and placing it on the desk by the window. Chang Gan put the vase away, turned around and met Zhang Jiayu's gaze. He trembled and cautiously asked, "Xian Zun." This is what he heard from the devil's mouth. Chang Gan has nowhere to go except here, and he found that this immortal could save his life, so he naturally refused to leave, and said eagerly, "In order to save the immortal venerable, I am willing to stay by your side, serve the immortal." Zhang Jiayu glanced at him and knocked on the copper stove, "Light the fire." Chang Gan went over obediently, injected a trace of demonic energy, the head of the beast on the lid of the copper stove lit up, and flames ignited in the belly immediately, driving away the cold of the snowy day in Zongnan Mountain. Zhang Jiayu was still wearing that fluffy cloak, the snow-white and thick, enveloping him heavily. Inside is a very thin-looking fairy robe, the color is like light ink, and there is no extra decoration. A few strands of his white hair fell softly around his shoulders. At this moment, I stretched out my hand to get close to the warmth from a little distance, and the bluish-white knuckles were warmed a little, like jade reflected by the firelight. Chang Gan looked stunned again. He stared at each other's long eyelashes, stared at his face. After watching for a while, Chang Gan's face slowly turned red, suddenly withdrew his eyes, and said dryly, "Xian Zun, you want to live here? How long?" "Live until I die." Zhang Jiayu glanced at him, "You don't need to be called Xian Zun, I am no longer." Chang Gan couldn't understand this sentence, he pulled his sleeve nervously, and said, "Then can I call you brother?" Zhang Jiayu's eyes paused for a while, and turned from the burning fire, as if remembering some past events, and after a while, he said, "As you wish." Chang Gan was overjoyed, feeling quite dependable, and happily went upstairs to continue packing. Zhang Jiayu warmed his hands for a while before removing all the chills from his body. His injuries have not healed, and he has no cultivation base. Although he looks comfortable on the surface, there will always be pain in his body from time to time. It's just that he doesn't care. He carried a storage tool on him, not his original one, but the most basic and ordinary tool that could be used without spiritual power. Zhang Jiayu put some medicinal wine, tea leaves, whisks, and some books in the Qunkan bag in the appearance of the incense bag, and took nothing else. The wind blew slightly outside. He warmed another jug of wine, poured it into the cup, and took a few sips slowly with the porcelain cup in his hands. This is the usual wine of the Lingxiao school, which is made to maintain the Taoist body for the monks. Zhang Jiayu usually drinks it like water, but now that his Taoist body is destroyed, he shouldn't actually drink more. The medicinal wine was very warm, but when the second cup entered his stomach, he had already provoked a heavy internal injury. The pain was densely spreading from the lungs, like a needle stick. Zhang Jiayu coughed lightly. He didn't expect that he was so fragile. He subconsciously supported the bed with one hand. When he clenched the side of the bed, the back of his hand was tensed, and the phalanges had not yet grown. A good sound, followed by a heavy pain, made him frown. From the sound of coughing, his pale and colorless lips were stained with bright red, causing even his shoulders to tremble. The heavy cloak slid off his shoulders, revealing a thin snow-white shirt. The wind moved slightly, and the footsteps outside the house stopped. Zhang Jiayu was in severe pain, ignoring the slight sound of footsteps, his palms were covered in cold sweat, and he breathed evenly. The man outside the window didn't know whether to come in or not. Wen Renai did not expect that he would see immortal venerable Ling Xiao, who is famous in all worlds again, in this way. In his memory, he only remembered the sword from hundreds of years ago, and he only remembered that he was standing on the cloud platform of the Ling Xiao faction in white clothes. In his hands, Ling Xiao sword is a peerless sword. Only Zhang Jilayu's straight hand when he clenched it is the ultimate destination of this sword. When Ren Ye stood still, he remembered Zhang Jilayu, and the brilliant and overwhelming sword light at that time, which was drawn from all directions and merged into one sword. I remember the eager blood that poured out when the sword light slashed through my heart, the old scars branded, and the look of the other party looking up almost no light can be seen. He became famous at a young age, and for the first time fell under the sword of others. When Renai's boiling blood to challenge him again slowly cooled down. He is Zhang Ziliu. How did he become like this? The news of the repair of the boundary membrane and the change of the head has not yet been introduced into the demon world. In the eyes of the demon world, the Ling Xiao faction still has the incomparable immortal venerable in the world, and it is still the leader of the four immortal sects, with Zhang immortal venerable overwhelming the world and shaking the universe. Until when Renai came here in person, he saw the scene of his lips stained with blood, frowning and coughing. Just as the new demon venerable stopped outside the window, Zhang Jilayu wiped off the blood on his lips, raised his eyes slightly, and took a picture with the person outside the window. Then, he looked at the black-clothed demon standing outside the window and suddenly became a little nervous. "Who are you?" Zhang Jilayu asked. When Renai was full of murderous intent and aggression, and the hostile aura of the other party was frozen by the situation at the moment. When Zhang Jilayu raised his eyes to ask questions, his demonic heart, which was under the scar on his heart, began to feel savage. Jumping randomly without warning, he jumped in panic. He had never seen each other so closely. "I am," Wen Renai said after a brief pause, "a new neighbor." Zhang Jilayu was silent for a moment, then said, "Zongnan Mountain has never been inhabited. So I'm new here." When Renai went through the window and pushed open the door, approached the small building, took off the dark long-haired cloak on his body, faded the coldness, and sat opposite Zhang Jilayu. The black hair of the demon race in front of him is tied up, his eyes are dark purple, and his handsome appearance carries some extremely sharp lethal power. Even in an extremely peaceful mood, it can make people dread. The human figures of the demons are all disguised, and their demon bodies are what they looked like when they were born. Zhang Jilayu glanced at him lightly, pushed the medicinal wine aside, and boiled water in the copper stove beside him to make tea, and said, "Just live with you, the mountain is not mine." When Renai stared at him, his eyes fell on the frosty white skin around the other's neck. "It's just that even if you live next to each other, don't come to disturb me often." Zhang Jilayu rarely makes tea with his own hands, and his movements are a little jerky. "You don't have to knock on the door, I sleep all day." When Renai wanted to say something, but when he saw his long snow-white hair, he suddenly got stuck again, but his eyes became more and more anxious and full of anxiety. He didn't realize how strong and explicit his eyes were. Zhang Jilayu made the tea, blew on the water gently, and then asked slowly, "Have I offended you?" He didn't wait for the other party to answer, and continued, "You look like you want to kill me, or you want to and then kill." When Renai, rape first and then kill. "Yes." Zhang Jilayu said as he put the slipped cloak on his shoulders, "I shouldn't have offended a great demon of your age, otherwise, I would have cut the grass and roots, and you would have no life to stand in front of me." When Renai still looked at him, and then said, "I won't hurt you. Don't you remember me?" Zhang Jilayu glanced at him, "Should I remember?" When Ren Ye was startled. It's hard to describe how that feels. When Renai's ability to come to this day is actually largely related to the splendid and tyrannical sword at the time, and to the person in front of him. He is a cultivator who only keeps getting stronger and improving himself in his eyes. He must be strong enough to be close to him and surpass him. Not long ago, when Renai broke through the realm, achieved the ability of half-step Jingxian, and took over the position of demon venerable from his father, but at that time Zhang Jilayu was wandering around and was uncertain and could not find it. After he had consolidated his cultivation, He happened to know the news that the other party was in Zongnan Mountain. He came full of flame and desire, but the will of God only gave him this scene. When Renai looked down, looking at his slender fingers, his skin was bloodless, revealing a sickly pale color. The flames went out and were covered by the frost in front of him. Zhang Jialiu only asked this question and did not continue. Although he did not know who the person in front of him was and had no impression of him, he could indeed feel that there was no killing intent in the complex emotions of the other party. As long as there was no killing intent, he doesn't care so much about details. The bitter tea in his hand was warmed. Zhang Jialiu lowered his head and took a sip, and the extremely bitter taste flowed past. But he did not move his brows. He drank a whole glass very habitually, and even poured a glass for Wen Renai in a rare friendly manner. Wen Renai took the tea and took a sip with a heavy heart. He was immediately numb to the tip of his tongue by the strong bitter taste, and even choked. He looked up at Zhang Ziliu, who was drinking tea calmly, and almost doubted his sense of taste. "How do you drink this?" He didn't finish asking a word, and asked the next sentence with anxiety, "You are so ill, why are you still here alone? Where are the people from Ling Xiao's faction? And your hair?" When Renai took a deep breath, not knowing where his anger came from, he calmed down a bit, reached out and touched the white hair by Zhang Jialiu's ear. The hair was like snow, withered and cold, with almost no luster. "How did you become like this?" He finally asked this question. Zhang Jialiu drank the tea slowly, moved out a hand to hold his fingers, and took back the hand that the devil was touching regardless of whether he was close or distant, and said, "Inquire about it yourself." His skin temperature was low, and after touching Wen Renai's hand, it became even colder. But this incomparably short contact made Wen Renai's heart beat wildly again, like a wild horse that couldn't stop, jumping and vying for favor in front of Zhang Ziliu, completely beating his heart violently against reason. As if burned, he pulled his hand back suddenly. If this wild horse has a place to have fun, the grassland must be called love at first sight. Lord Mojun, who suspected that he was getting angry, was so hot that he almost wanted to dig out the deer that was about to die in his heart. He was afraid that the smell of blood would scare the other party, so he endured it and said, "Don't touch me indiscriminately." Zhang Jialiu was silent for a few breaths. "Didn't you tease me first? How can I pick my hair?" When Renai's words stopped, and he was silent for a long while, watching Zhang Ziliu drinking the terribly bitter cup of tea on the opposite side as if nothing had happened. There was a faint cold air on the other side. Whether it was by the fireplace or not, it radiated from the inside out. When Renai looked at him through the fire, and the deer in his heart was about to die. Seeing him put down the teacup, his eyebrows frowned, and there was not a trace of light in his dark eyes. The little deer jumped for a long time, and its hoof was wobbled, and all the messed up thoughts disappeared without a trace, and only the pain was left. When Renai took a deep breath and wanted to ask him if he wanted to go to the demon realm with him. Before he could say a word, there were obvious footsteps and a young boy's cheerful tone from upstairs. "Brother, I have packed up the second floor. There is a cabinet for books, do you want to?" Chang Gan leaned on the stair railing, his words stopped abruptly, and he stared blankly at the man sitting opposite Zhang Ziliu, his brain completely shut down, and then his voice trembled, little uncle." When Renai glanced at him and ignored him, but said to Zhang Jialiu, "He called you brother." "Well." Zhang Jialiu connected the events of the past few days according to Chang Gan's name, roughly guessed the identity of the person in front of him, and nodded. When Renai didn't know why the other party took in Chang Gan, so he pondered for a moment and said, "Actually, I was also hunted down." Xiao Chang'an, who was rolling and crawling down, heard these words the moment he came over. He stood beside him dumbfounded, staring at his uncle in a stunned manner. "I don't have anyone to take it in either." When Renai didn't feel how shameless this was. Chang Gan was completely stunned. He looked at his little uncle and then at his immortal elder brother. "I can take care of you too." Wen Renai got closer and closer as he talked, and in the end he was almost only a few inches away from Zhang Jilayu, and even his breath was in front of his eyes. Zhang Jilayu's eyelashes trembled slightly, and said lightly, "That's why I live with you," Wen Renai said. Zhang Jilayu was stabbed by the attacking demonic energy on the other side, and frowned a little uncomfortably, and said, "What if I don't agree? Rape first and then kill." The man looked fierce. The room was silent for a while, only the sound of the wind from the outside gradually became louder, blowing open the door of the small building. The sharp demonic energy on the opponent almost completely enveloped him, wrapping around his broken body. Zhang Jilayu looked at him quietly, raised his hand against the other's eyebrows and pushed it back, and said, "Go and close the door, I'm cold." The door was closed, and the cold wind was blocked out. Wen Renai failed to convince Zhang Ziliu immediately. Even if the other party is in this situation, even if his expression is calm and unwavering, he can still restrain his violently beating heart with a single glance, so that he cannot be born with a single compulsive idea. Wen Renai really became his neighbor, building a house in the blink of an eye, effortlessly. A small garden appeared out of thin air on one side of the pinewood building, and the distance between the two residences was only separated by a wall. The sun moved down, and it gradually turned to dusk, and the sky was dark. Chang Gan was still shocked by what happened to his little uncle, and after thinking about it for a long time, he couldn't figure out what was going on. While packing the books for the immortal brother, he muttered, "Where did he get hunted down? Where did he come homeless?" Even Chang Gan felt that this little uncle, who had always ignored him, had a bad heart. Although he has a thin kinship with Wen Renai, the other party does not really regard him as a relative. The other party is the young master of the royal family and the new demon venerable. How can he be compared with him as a half-demon? On the contrary, it was Zhang Jilayu. Although the two had only known each other for a day and a night, the other party had already saved his life and did not dislike his identity. When Chang Gan was thinking about it, he couldn't help but lean towards Zhang Jilayu, thinking that even if Brother Immortal was powerful, he still looked injured. How could he let such a big devil accompany him? He put the book away and turned around, just in time to see Zhang Ziliu's back. Zhang Jilayu sat on the rattan chair, took off the cloak outside and put it over his legs, and looked at a book under the candle. He took off his hair crown, and the long snow-white hair was a little dazzling, swaying slightly on the shoulders, revealing a peaceful and docile taste. Reading seems to be very careless, eyes do not move, as if distracted. Chang Gan swallowed his saliva, leaned in slowly, and whispered, "Brother." Zhang Jilayu was sluggish for a moment, then raised his eyes to look at him. You won't believe my little uncle. Chang Gan is still 11 or 12 years old, somewhere between a teenager and a child. My little uncle is not a homeless demon at all, he is Smell the Night. Zhang Jilayu gave a hum and said calmly, "So, what is his identity?" Chang Gan opened his eyes wide, as if he didn't expect Zhang Ziliu to know, and quickly said, "He is Wen Renjian's eldest son." Wen Renjian. This time Zhang Jilayu finally had some impressions. He only had a little memory of the Lord of the Demon Realm. He remembered that the Lord did not have such a strong racial exclusion, but the city was deep and he was a smiling tiger. Zhang Jilayu nodded, which just matched the guess in his heart, and said, "It turned out to be the young master of the devil world." Chang Gan was stunned for a while, and when he realized that the news between the two worlds was blocked, he quickly said, "No, he has." Only 3 words were said in this sentence, the door suddenly slammed, and the footsteps of men entered the small building. "What's wrong?" Wen Renai looked over from the door, her purple eyes dimmed. "What are you talking about?" Chang Gan was so frightened that he went out of his body, hid behind Zhang Ziliu with a swoosh, and then ran upstairs, full of the guilty conscience of a thief. Zhang Jilayu looked at the sound and saw that the other party was wearing a black robe with a large blood-red cloak covered in frost and snow. With a flick of the cloak feathers, the snowflakes on it melted away in an instant. Wen Ren untied the ties of his cloak while walking at night, hung the cloak on the back of the chair on the other side, and sat beside Zhang Ziliu. "What are you doing here again, good neighbor?" Zhang Ziliu jokingly said, and then picked up the scroll under the lamp and continued to read it on his lap through the plush cloak. "Of course I'm here to help you." Wen Renai said, "You are so pitiful, like a bereaved dog sent out by Ling Xiao. Really can't speak." Zhang Ziliu glanced at him. "You have a home to pay back, why are you here?" "I'm here because of you." Wen Renai said, "I want to cure you." Zhang Ziliu stopped flipping the book for a moment, frowned slightly, and said after a while, "It can't be cured. Besides, I'm fine now, your sympathy is in the wrong place." Wen Renai sat beside him, looking at his snow-white long eyelashes, which cast a faint shadow under the candlelight, and the very light and soft breath on his body, like a melted layer thin cream. "I have no sympathy for you," he said. Wen Renai stretched out his hand, his fingertips stopped an inch before he was about to touch him, stopped for a while in midair, then retracted it, and said, "The first seat of Xianmen, half-step Jingxian. You are already at the peak of the road. Is it worth it to lose everything for others at one time?" It seems that Wen Renai has already asked people to inquire about what happened in the cultivation world. Zhang Ziliu's story can't be hidden, and it will be completely spread in a few days. Zhang Ziliu continued to read, his fingertips moved with his eyes, but did not speak. Wen Renai took out a hand stove from the storage ring, which is also a magic tool, but this magic tool is rare and rare, it doesn't even need to be injected into the magic, even mortals can use it freely. He put the hand stove carved with the big beasts into Zhang Ziliu's arms, and continued, "Most of the people you saved are selfish and vulgar villains, they will not care about your sacrifice, they will only ask for the benefits you can gain after sacrificing, just like your junior brother. Zhu Yuxin's reputation is actually not too bad. He is a genius cultivator of the Ling Xiao faction, but he has been crushed by Zhang Ziliu all the year round, and he ranks second in everything. Whether it is cultivation, appearance, temperament, swordsmanship, or even the appreciation of elders, he is always slightly lower." At that time, Zhu Wenyuan was caught in the secret magic of the demon world and was in danger. When he was about to die, he called Zhang Ziliu and Zhu Yuxin to the couch together. In front of all the elders, he passed the position of head to Zhang Ziliu, not his own son. Since then, Zhu Yuxin's character has undergone slight changes, but Zhang Ziliu will always treat him like his own younger brother, unchanged for thousands of years. Zhang Ziliu frowned slightly, but said nothing. Wen Renai adjusted the temperature of the magic weapon, pushed it into the other's free hand, and touched the coldness of the other's fingertips. "Do you know how long the Ling Xiao faction, and even the entire cultivation world, have been peaceful under your protection?" Wen Renai looked at him and said, "The demons are naturally ruthless and good at fighting, why would they rather make contracts every year and not pay any attention to them? No aggressiveness. Why are the two true monarchs of the demon world willing to befriend you? All conflicts between the two worlds are left to you to handle, not even a single word, and the nether world, which is silent all the year round." He paused for a moment, then said, "Zhang Ziliu, as long as you are here, there will always be other ways. But they are not worth it." Zhang Ziliu folded his fingers, attracted by the comfortable temperature on the magic weapon, he slowly fitted it, looked away from the book, looked at the other party, and calmly said, "I have become a waste, you should be happy, instead of telling me whether it's worth it or not. In my opinion, it is a good thing from heaven to be able to unload 1,000 jinns and get rid of the endless sea of suffering, and I should be grateful. You. I don't like demons, because you have too many ideas." Zhang Ziliu said, "I don't want to be the backing in the hearts of all beings in the world, and I don't want to hold on any longer. Is it wrong?" Wen Renai's words paused, and his eyes looked straight at him. There was a twinkle in his purple eyes. After a while, he asked in a low voice, "You don't like demons? Is this the point?" Zhang Jialiu didn't expect his focus to be like this, neither nodding nor shaking his head. He could only watch Wen Renai's vaguely hurt expression, and held his hand. Zhang Jialiu looked at the other party's hand, and saw that the other party held him nervously first, then wrapped around his wrist and grasped it tightly, as if he had just remembered something serious, poured a wisp of demonic energy into his wrist from the fingertips and penetrated into the meridians. Middle. As the other party probed his physical condition, he continued to ask, "Then what do you like?" "Zhang Jialiu, I like you." The wisp of demonic energy that penetrated into his body almost ran away, and it was dangerously stable. The ruthless Lord Moshen's mind was blank, his ears were buzzing. He looked at Zhang Jialiu stupidly, and after a while he said, "I like me." He hasn't taken advantage of it, hasn't cultivated feelings, hasn't pried away the corner of the cultivation world, how could he? "I like you to talk less," Zhang Jialiu said lightly. Wen Renai was already thinking about the name of the 18th child in the future, and then all his thoughts were split into smoke by these words, leaving only the glass residue on the ground. The demonic energy that penetrated into his body paused for a long time, and after finishing his mood, he continued to investigate. The more Wen Renai understood his physical condition, the more his heart sank. The meridians in Zhang Jialiu's body were chaotically messed up, and there were injuries everywhere. The Yuan Ying was so broken that it was almost impossible to see its appearance, and the Yuan Shen, even if he didn't investigate, he knew that it would not be much better. There was a throbbing pain in his chest, and it was hard to believe that this person would become like this. He and Zhu Wuxin had the same understanding, and he always felt that Zhang Jialiu was extremely tyrannical and unmatched, that he was omnipotent, and everyone admired him. For him, it is no different from the dust in the world. All his vigor was used in this, wanting to compete with him, beside him, or even surpass him. But now, Wen Renai slowly removed his hand, looked at Zhuang Bai's wrist and fingertips, and said in silence, "It's all like this, and I can still bear it." His words stopped, and he didn't get a response, so he turned his eyes and looked at Zhang Jialiu. The scroll in the other's hand stopped at the page that was opened halfway through, and never moved again. He changed his posture on the rattan chair, lay on his side and closed his eyes. His white hair was softly scattered on his shoulders, and his eyelashes were long and thin. The light shone brightly, illuminating his smooth, slightly thin chin and pale skin. For a moment, Wen Renai suddenly felt that even if he was vulnerable, it was a gift from the world to him. Zhang Jialiu appeared in his eyes, which should have been extremely cherished. In the past, he was the master of Ling Xiaojian, the head of the immortal gate that made the world bow his head, cold as the blade of a sword, as cold as ice on a blade. But now, he can just hold the melted snow at will, loose and soft, but it won't stay in anyone's fingers. Wen Renai watched for a while, and asked in a low voice, "Are you asleep?" The other party did not move. He stretched out his hand, wanting to take away half of the book he had seen, and carried him to the bed, but got a little resistance from the book. Zhang Jialiu put the scroll in his arms and said in a low voice, "I'll read it later." "Aren't you sleepy?" Wen Renai picked up his cloak and replaced the one on his body. The large blood-colored cloak can cover him from the shoulders, but it is much lighter than the quilt and will not make people uncomfortable. Zhang Jialiu didn't answer immediately, but when the temperature under the cloak gradually warmed up, he whispered softly, "Don't talk to me, I'm so tired." With Wen Renai's cultivation base, he could naturally hear these words clearly. He sat next to Zhang Jialiu, watching the candles shaking, listening to the night wind passing through the window, and feeling the slow breathing sound of the other party when he fell asleep. Everything was extremely quiet. Wen Renai didn't know where his trust in him came from, or maybe he didn't trust him at all, he just didn't care about anything. All missions have been completed, and his responsibility and meaning from childhood to adulthood ends here. In the past, Zhang Jialiu seemed to live for the Ling Xiao faction and the cultivation world. At this point, he can finally live for himself. Therefore, he doesn't care about anything, and being able to sleep peacefully when he is tired is the most comfortable thing in the world. When Renai sat aside and looked at him, the candles were dimly lit, and the surroundings were quiet. Infinite tenderness. Demon world. There is a Wanling palace in the center of the demon world, which is the residence of the two true monarchs of the demon clan. The Wanling palace is built between giant trees and trees, surrounded by trees and vines, which has a natural charm. At this moment, the little demons in the Wanling palace lowered their brows and pleaded with their eyes, keeping silent. Can you believe his words? You don't know Zhu Wuxin's virtue. The red-haired and red-clothed man slapped the table in a fiery manner, and the spirit wood table under his palm trembled, and the lines were full of lines. The man's appearance is about 25 or 6 years old. There is a scarlet phoenix mark between the eyebrows, Danfan eyes, and the shape of the eyes is curved inward and outward, and he is handsome and sharp. With red hair and red eyes, the clothes are full of striking fiery red, the shoulders are decorated with phoenix feathers, and the sleeves have golden patterns, which are extremely eye-catching. The gang of Luo Shi's immortal sect are also a bunch of waste. They can't find anyone for so many days. If something happens, I have to step on the cultivation world and kill Zhu Wuxin. Liejin became more and more irritable, got up suddenly, wandered in the Wanling palace, and became more and more angry. Finally, he pulled out the flame sword from his waist and turned to leave. You come back to me. The woman in Xingyi in the seat next to her slowly drank tea, glanced at him, and said, Go and kill Zhu Wuxin. If Zhalu comes back, you will be the first to break up with him. This sentence was like a basin of ice water, pouring it on Zhenjun Suzaku's head. Liejin paced repeatedly, his brows furrowed tightly, and then he slashed into the floor of the inner hall of Wanling Palace, gritted his teeth, and said, I won't kill anyone, I'll go find him. There are so many people in the cultivation world, and they haven't found where Zhalu is. It will work if you go. Qinglin took another sip of tea. Do you know where he will go? Liejin held the long sword in his hand, and his heart was a little hotter than the fire, and together with the phoenix feather on his shoulders, sparks floated outwards, flickering in the air. Then, where do you think he will go? Li Zhen frowned and said, he left the Ling Xiao faction, where else can he go? With his destroyed body, he doesn't have to suffer wherever he goes. Qinglin rolled up his long hair and tied it with a dragon-shaped hosta. His eyebrows were picturesque and his tone was even. I think you should be worried. With your good looks, it won't be very dangerous to go anywhere. On weekdays, Zhang Zhalu Ziyue was around. Even if the two of them together could only win by half, there was no chance of winning by fighting alone. The overly tyrannical strength sheltered his appearance and made Zhang Zhalu at the top. Everyone only dared to talk about his strength, but not dare to say that he was beautiful. As a result, Liejin forgot about this for a while. With the beauty of his friend. With a hum in Liejin's mind, he wanted to tear Zhu Wuxin apart again, and said ruthlessly, when I find Zhalu, I will persuade him not to be soft-hearted and help him kill that ungrateful witty-eyed wolf. Although you say that he is ungrateful, I think that Zhu Wuxin may not be willing to let Zhalu get involved in danger. Qinglin said, although Zhu Wuxin is narrow-minded and secretly jealous, he has great trust in his senior brother, and his mind is complicated. Maybe you want to hide people, and then, Qinglin mentioned a more dangerous idea, and the flames around Liejin's body burned again, stabbing people all over hot. She hurriedly changed her mind and said, that little thing may not understand her own mind, don't think about it. I think that Zhu Wuxin can rest assured to let him go, and Zhalu is willing to go, only, the spirit of the former true monarch Ling Xiao. Mound. When Li Zhen heard these words, his anxious steps stopped immediately, he thought for a few breaths, and said, Zongnan Mountain. It snows for half a year in that place, and there are many mountain spirits and wild monsters. He Qinglin patted the corner of his robe, cut off his words, and analyzed, Zongnan Mountain is an excellent spiritual place, so Zhalu chose to bury his teacher here. Although there are many mountain spirits and monsters above, but they are all born to nourish spiritual power, and there are few fierce monsters, not to mention, have you forgotten what kind of physique your friend is? It would be better if she didn't say it. Liejin's tail feathers would explode when she mentioned this. Heavenly spirit body, what kind of broken physique that hinders people's cultivation? Although the celestial body is rare, it is not a unique physique. It seems to only appear on men. It is characterized by its ability to attract the surrounding creatures, and it is easy to generate affinity. This is also because Zhang Jilayu is cold, quiet, but one of the reasons why he is extremely liked by little demons and is unconsciously approached by many junior fellow practitioners. However, this constitution will also hinder the practice, making the spiritual power entering the body too lively and difficult to control. If you want to control it delicately, you have to put in several times more effort than ordinary people. Everyone said that he was a genius, but everyone knew that this evaluation was the greatest contempt for everything he had experienced. It's not bad, at least those mountain spirits and wild monsters will not hurt him under normal conditions. Qinglin thought for a while, and then said, it's just that all the records about this physique have advised the latecomers to stop. I love it so much, I don't know why. Liejin snorted and said, it's all records. Qinglin was familiar with the other party's thoughts, and naturally knew that he was secretly thinking about some ulterior motives, so he said, in this way, Zhalu is probably really in Zongnan Mountain. Is it? Her words only reminded half of it, that this short-tempered and impulsive Suzaku had already turned into a prototype, flew out of the Wanling Palace, and illuminated half of the demon world's dome with bright red and bright colors. Qinglin flipped through the book, saw what she said was recorded, and pondered for a long time. What kind of disasters would make the recorders have to be vague to wake up future generations? And all the recorded celestial bodies, as the recorder warned, cut off love and never had a partner for life. Zongnan Mountain. The pinewood building and the bamboo garden next to it, even if separated by a wall, are almost useless. When Renai didn't know what he was thinking, like a squirrel hoarding goods, he stuffed the pinewood building up and down to the top, and brought everything that was useful and not needed, almost giving Zhang Ziliu a kind of the illusion that he is building a nest. Winter has not yet passed, and it is another snowy day. The cloak on Zhang Ziliu was replaced by Wen Renai, and he wore a dark cloak produced in the devil world. The soft fur around his neck was very soft. Zhang Ziliu still liked it, but there was a smell of Wenren on it. Yi's breath is like the smell of pines and cypresses. If he smells it for a long time, he will lose his ability to distinguish. Even when Wenren yet is close to him, he can't recognize it immediately. It was snowing all the time outside the window, and Chang'an turned into a small snake's nest at Zhang Ziliu's feet. Perhaps because of the drop in temperature, the little black snake was still lying at his feet at first, then suddenly crawled up from behind, wrapped around Zhang Ziliu's clothes, gently curled its tail, and retracted into his arms. Zhang Ziliu was halfway through reading the book, and was approached by Liang Sisi's little snake eyes. He glanced at Chang'an's well-behaved appearance, hesitated for a while, but did not flick it away. He has always been very fond of animal spirits, and the closer he is to the species of nature, the easier he is to perceive his affinity. For example, when he met the two true monarchs of the demon world, Qinglong, the true monarch, Qinglin once said meaningfully to him, "The first time I saw you, I was almost fascinated." It was also at that time that he realized that the smell on his body was very powerful to the demon clan, just like catnip to cats, any goblin would want to come up and take 2 sips. He was used to being catnip, so naturally he didn't feel that there was anything wrong with Chang'an, so he continued to read. However, after only looking at 2 lines, the sky of Zongnan Mountain suddenly turned from black and gloomy to red, to a dark red that was congealed and dried up like blood. The dark red gradually faded and turned into rust red. Then, a vermilion bird that was as bright as blood and surrounded by flames rushed in from the sky, smashing the door of the pinewood building with a bang, and in the blink of an eye, it was in front of you. Zhang Jialiu looked up and saw Li Zhen's red eyes looking straight at him. The emotions inside were complicated and strong, and he was relieved when he saw that he had no arms or legs. Zhang Jialiu only had time to throw the little black snake in his arms, and was hugged by the Suzaku who flew over from the demon world. His strong heartbeat sounded violently through the clothes, and the body temperature rose. How can you do such a dangerous thing? Liejin hugged him firmly, and his hanging heart finally fell, but then he let go of the other party with a guilty conscience, reached out and touched his snow-white hair. His fingertips trembled after a moment. He rolled his Adam's apple and said anxiously, "Come back to the demon realm with me. Has that Zhu Yuxin done something bad? Stop protecting him, I will help you recover." Zhang Jialiu didn't listen to the last few sentences at all, but was silent for a moment, and said, "My door. Broken again." He didn't know what to say to politely remind the other party to give him a door. Just as he was thinking about this for a short time, another figure appeared next to the broken wooden door of the small building. Liejin, who had said a lot of words, suddenly stopped, feeling a tit-for-tat killing intent, standing up slowly, turning his head to look at the door. A big devil in black clothes and purple eyes approached step by step. He seemed to twist his wrist casually, the knuckles of the fingers disguised as humanoids protruded, and the bone spurs came out from the joints, with pitch-black sharp nails, all over his body. They were all full of hostility and murderous intent, but they all disappeared when they approached Zhang Jialiu, as if nothing had happened. Demons are demons, and demons are always hideous and terrifying. Liejin turned around and stood in front of Zhang Jialiu, with flames burning in his red eyes, like a burst of boiling lava in his eyes. He hooked his lips, and his tone was full of hostility. "Why are you here?" It was only recently that he learned that when Renai successfully broke through and became a half-step Jinxian, in charge of the devil world. If it was in the past, he could still fight Wen Renai, but now, he is not sure. And according to the normal spread of news, it should be the last to arrive in the devil world. How could he appear here? There is nothing else in Zongnan Mountain, only the beauty of his good friend. Liejin found the answer almost instantly. He blocked in front, automatically put Wen Renai into the column of rivals in love, and lowered his hand to hold the flaming sword around his waist. Before he could draw his sword, he heard Zhang Ziliu's voice behind him. "Li Zhen? It's a little hot." Liejin's body temperature will change with his emotions. At this moment, he is extremely nervous and anxious, and the temperature is almost beyond the tolerance range of ordinary people. In the past, Zhang Jialiu was immune to cold and heat, and naturally he couldn't feel the high temperature on his body, but now, this temperature has exceeded the limit. The tone of these words is not serious, but all of Liejin's thinking and preparations are disrupted, and his spirit is suddenly relaxed. The temperature dropped sharply, and then, the big demon stretched out his hand and pressed his shoulder, pushing him aside, with such force that it almost crushed the bones on Suzaku's body, making a crisp cracking sound. Wen Renai sat beside Zhang Jialiu as if nothing had happened, as if he was not the one who almost crushed the bird just now, and said to Zhang Jialiu, "I cleaned out the hot springs behind Zongnan Mountain. It's hard work, good neighbor." Zhang Jialiu called him that as usual, then glanced at Liejin next to him. "Do you know each other?" Wen Renai didn't even look away, licked his lips casually, and his whole body exuded a sense of violence and danger that he couldn't tell when he would do it. "I've met once." Zhang Jialiu nodded and said to Liejin, "I'm fine here, I don't need to go back, and I don't need to go to the demon world to disturb me." The cluster of red feathers erected behind Li Zhen's ears trembled a few times. Frowning at Zhang Ziliu's appearance, he said indifferently, "You are all good? Your neighbor is not a good thing, aren't you afraid that he will eat you?" Before Zhang Jialiu could answer, Wen Renai sneered from the side, and his tone was cold. "True Lord Suzaku, before talking about others, look at your own species." Liejin was told the central matter in one sentence, and the spark next to the phoenix feather on his shoulder appeared again, and he slapped the case with a slap. looking at Wen Renai as if he was looking at another toad that had never looked in the mirror. Toad. Just when the atmosphere was tense, there were a few very light coughs from the side. The voice was very light, almost like a low, muffled cough when it was not suppressed, but it still pulled the sanity of the two back in an instant, as if they had been soaked in ice water. They were all awake. Zhang Ziliu had just been injured by Liejin's body temperature. He thought he could endure it, but he couldn't help but show it. He wiped off a bit of bright red from the corners of his lips, and his internal organs were burning and aching. But he just frowned and didn't react too much. Then, seeing that the two of them were no longer arguing, he gestured to the destroyed door and said, "Little Suzaku, you broke my door. Isn't it just a door? The Wanling Palace of the Demon World will be given to you. Fix the door for me. Wait for a quarter of an hour, and I'll fix it right away." The speed of Liejin repairing the door is very fast. It really only takes half an hour. The original door frame of the Pinewood building has been replaced by the Wanling Stone of the Demon World, with the personal aesthetics of Genjun Suzaku. Chang'an, who had been thrown down before, also turned back into a human form. For a while, he looked at the real monarch of the demon clan with red hair and phoenix feathers, and then looked at the little uncle of the devil in black clothes and blood cloak, and then looked nervously at the immortal who lowered his head and drank medicine. "Brother, I feel as if I am at the center of a wondrous vortex." The little boy squatted beside the medicine stove and emptied the remaining medicine residue. Then he took the bowl from Zhang Ziliu's hand. This medicine is a very common medicine, so ordinary that it is like the kind of crude prescription that ordinary mortals would drink. But Zhang Ziliu can only take this now. He can't carry the spiritual energy in the elixir. His Taoist body is shattered, like a sieve with loopholes everywhere. The spiritual energy is scattered everywhere, and there is not a trace of it left. When Renai once asked about the prescription, knowing that it was a prescription written by Zhang Ziliu himself, and also knowing his physical condition, so he did not change it without authorization. "This medicine has no other use, just pain relief." Zhang Ziliu was so used to bitterness that even after drinking a whole bowl of medicine, he could not feel too strong bitterness. He then took another sip of tea, looked at Li Zhen, who was still sulking, and said slowly, "When did the demon world know about it?" True monarch Suzaku pressed the fire and glanced at him. When he saw his white withered hair and dark eyes, all the anger in his heart seemed to sink into the ice cave, and not even a spark could emerge. "I just found out today." "That's not too fast." Zhang Ziliu said lightly, "You can find this place, it should be taught by Qing Long. I think it's not a day or two to take care of your life, and it's hard to wait until the head is full of grey hair. You have to come to disturb me." Li Zhen's words were full of choking. He dragged the seat forward in a dull manner, reached out to grab his wrist, and while exploring the meridians, he said, "You are just going to be mad at me. Hanging out with a demon. Otherwise, do you shoot him out?" Zhang Ziliu suggested casually. When Renai listened quietly, showing a rare polite smile, "Come." Li Zhen's scarlet long hair started to explode out of thin air around him. He gave Wen Renai a vicious look, turned his head and said to Zhang Ziliu, "When I come with Qinglin, I will definitely be able to save you." Zhang Ziliu looked at him for a while, and said, "You can also repair the boundary membrane by joining forces with Qinglin. It is easier for the spirit of nature to repair it than me." Liejin stopped suddenly. The boundary membrane is damaged, and the spiritual energy of the cultivation world is extracted first. The demon world wants to wait until the cultivation world declines and everything is destroyed, and then capture it in one fell swoop, and then start repairing. Or, you are waiting for me. There was silence all around, even the sound of breathing was low. My serious injury is what you expected. For the demon world, it's all beneficial and not harmful. Zhang Ziliu brushed his sleeves and pulled his wrist back from his fingers. The world of self-cultivation is connected to the human world. There are trillions of beings. My friend, Yang Mu is ahead, I have to enter. Li Zhen shook his hand bluntly, but he couldn't hold his hand, but touched the snow-white thin sleeve. Zhalu, I. He was so flustered that he didn't know what to say. I didn't expect it to be this serious. So. Zhang Jiayu said, you have seen what I am now. No sympathy, no guilt. You and I have different positions. I don't blame you. Li Zhen stared at him blankly, his red eyes were full of panic. He hurriedly reached out his hand and grabbed Zhang Jiayu's arm, and quickly said, I don't sympathize with you, I am. Actually I. How dare he say what he is holding back, his heart like a flame is frozen, and his mind is sober like never before. I will leave you a body protection spirit mark, I am afraid you will be bullied. Before he could finish his words, Zhang Jiayu just frowned slightly, and the little vermilion bird in front of him was picked up by one hand. When Renai's fingers turned at will, and the barbs on the edges of the knuckles would be revealed, revealing half of the demon body, showing a hideous appearance from the forearm to the fingers. The fingers condensed with demonic energy grabbed Li Zhen's robe, and the bone spur almost pressed against his throat. I'm here. When Renai said indifferently, no one will hurt him. Just the second after Suzaku's flames blazed into the air, when Renai withdrew his hand and turned around, and the demonic energy rushed past like a sharp blade, knocking Li Zhen's backhand to the ground, smashing the hollow bones on his shoulders. The cracking sound gradually became clear. The soaring flames wrapped around the body of true monarch Suzaku, and when those bright red eyes lifted, they met the fingertip bone spurs that when Renai had turned into a demon, almost pierced his eyes. Just as the bone spur was approaching inch by inch in front of him, Zhang Jiayu, who was drinking tea by the side, put down the porcelain lid and said, Good neighbor, the medicine is bitter, do you have any sweets? When Renai's movements paused for a moment, and then the entire magical shape disappeared, returning to human forearms and palms, and turned his head to glance at Zhang Jiayu. Zhang Jiayu still looked ordinary, his eyes were pitch black, and not even a trace of light could penetrate. But he was wearing a thin snow coat and long, withered hair that seemed to melt at his fingertips at any time. When Renai's hostility slowly dissipated, and his murderous intent relaxed, he ignored the demon clan, but took out a plate of candied fruit from the storage ring, but did not hand it to Zhang Jiayu. Zhang Jiayu looked at him standing in front of him. Is the bitter medicine? After a short silence, Zhang Jiayu said, Of course it is. Lie. When Renai picked up a piece of candied fruit and handed it to Zhang Jiayu's lips, you can't taste anything that is bitter. He has been preparing this plate of candied fruit for a long time. From the second day he saw Zhang Jiayu, he regarded this person as a sickly willow sapling. He felt that his medicine would be bitter, that he would frown and resent it. At this time, you can feed the willow sapling something sweet. But the other party is not like that at all. When he drank the medicine, he didn't blink, as if there was no taste associated with bitterness. It is his heart that suffers. Zhang Jiayu glanced at the candied fruit he handed over and said, Do you all feed your neighbors like this in the demon world? You. He was stuffed into his mouth, and the fruit had been marinated in sugar, and it was so sweet that it was seldom tasted and spread on the tip of his tongue. Afterwards, when Renai leaned down, looked at him and said, You have worked so hard for so many years, and all the good friends you have met are all of this virtue. Zhang Jiayu wanted to say that this was one of the two kings of the demon world, but before he could swallow the candied fruit in his mouth, he saw Wen Renai drag the little Suzaku out with a frightening force. True monarch Suzaku's bones are all hollow, his body is very light, his attack power is the most powerful, and he is covered in flames to protect his body. The young master of the demon world. Zhang Jiayu looked at his back, thought of the words the future is terrible, and wanted to smile, but then he thought of the younger generation of the cultivation world, and the junior brother he raised from childhood to adulthood, but he couldn't smile. The sweetness between his lips was still there. He raised the teacup and took a sip, frowning his brows, as if it was the first time he felt that this was a very bitter cup of tea. If he hadn't tasted the sweetness, he wouldn't have felt that way. Liejin didn't leave immediately, but turned into a vermilion bird and landed on the ancient tree outside the pinewood building. There was a lamp in the room, and it was bright. While classifying the medicinal materials collected from Mount Zongnan, Chang Gan quietly looked at the immortal brother who was reading a book, hesitated for a while, and then said, "Brother." Zhang Jilayu responded and asked, "What's wrong?" "I heard some people talking at the foot of the mountain today, as if they were looking for my brother." Chang Gan lowered his head and said, "They said they couldn't find it in the entire cultivation world, and they were dying of anxiety." Zhang Jilayu listened quietly and did not speak. They were in a hurry, but it was because they didn't see it as believing that they were in a hurry to meet each other. All the seemingly respectful words are excuses, and the heart of some immortal sex-righteous path is far worse than that of little Suzaku, who has a different stance. Chang Gan seemed to think this topic was not good, and quickly changed it. "I met a deer at the foot of the mountain. He said he was homeless. I was thinking about whether to." As he said that, he cautiously raised his eyes to look at Zhang Jilayu, and continued, "I am willing to serve you, as long as my brother can occasionally give him some pointers on his practice." Zhang Jilayu nodded. He had always had a good impression of the deer demon, and said casually, "If that's the case, you can bring him here." Chang Gan nodded excitedly, as if he felt that he had an extra playmate. His appearance is still only a boy of 11 or 12 years old, and his mental age is not very large. In Zhang Ziliu's eyes, he is still a playful child. Zhang Jilayu didn't care about a few little demons coming over. He used to take in homeless little demons often. What's more, this is Zongnan Mountain, the place where Zhongling Yuxiu is beautiful, and it is a rare evil monster. He was tired from reading and was a little sleepy. Just when he was a little distracted, the candle light on the side was lit, and a breath similar to pine and cypress permeated. Zhang Jilayu raised his eyes and watched his good neighbor naturally pull over the seat to sit across from him, his eyes as if he had never eaten in his life, full of strong appetite. Zhang Jilayu was unsure, looked down at himself, recalled the recipes of the Demon Realm royal family, and said, "Hungry? No." Zhang Jilayu rolled up the book in his hand, knocked on the back of Wen Rinai's hand, and said, "Then I don't even understand, what are you asking for when you are by my side?" He paused for a moment and continued, "My cultivation base is completely useless, you have already explored it. I have nothing, I am poor, and I can't even use a magic weapon. You can see it one by one. Do you not want to let go of your guard, but you are not willing to kill him?" When Rinai didn't have any killing intent towards him, he could still judge that. When Zhang Jilayu said this, he also thought of another possibility, looked at him for a moment, and said in deep thought, "Even if you want to eat me, it's just a meal." His current body, which is barely maintained, is about to shatter after a few toss. When Rinai should not want to kill him yet. Hearing his last sentence, the other party's mind had already spread from one meal to every meal, but when he came back to his senses, he happened to see Zhang Ziliu's dark eyes staring at him. The yellow fragment disappeared suddenly, as if covered by a thin and hidden chill. When Rinai's expression froze for a moment, and then he said, "I want to take care of your body." Zhang Jilayu looked at him silently, the snow-white eyelashes were almost transparent under the light of the candles. "And then have a showdown with you. I'll take revenge for the one arrow I lost to you that year." When Rinai spoke very persistently and seemed extremely frank. Zhang Jilayu looked at him for a long time, but did not see any hypocrisy in the other's eyes. In a place he couldn't see, the heart in this demon's chest was beating frantically, and the scar of the sword that was slashed by the Ling Xiao sword at that time was faintly hot, and together with his youthful glance, the wishful thinking in front of him gradually followed. Heating up and burning gradually. When Ren Yezi's eyes darkened, staring at him too persistently. Zhang Jilayu has defeated too many people. He actually doesn't remember when he won Wen Rinai, but it doesn't prevent him from finding it interesting. Over the years, he has helped many juniors, and the most promising of them is Jin Yuja, the young pavilion master of Wushuan Jianzhi, but even he is not as obsessed with his past defeat as Wen Renai. Zhang Jiayu nodded and smiled slightly, but I don't want to be cured. The flame in Wen Renai's heart suddenly stagnated, and the residual warmth was hot to his throat, burning out the words he had prepared. Being able to choose life and death is the little freedom I have left in my life. But Zhang Jiayu stopped his words and continued, but for your interesting neighbor, I will try to leave as late as possible. Wen Renai's heart was hanging in his throat, and he didn't know if he should breathe a sigh of relief. He held Zhang Ziliu's fingers, knocked tightly, and said slowly, "To look at me." "Well," Zhang Jiayu said, "look at the future of the demon world. Perhaps, it will also be the future of the world." In the early morning of the next day, Chang Gan really brought in the deer he encountered. After Zhang Jiayu had washed up, his long hair was not tied, and he was thinking about what to plant in Zongnan Mountain when the winter passed. Halfway through his thoughts, he heard the sound of hoofs outside the small building. Afterwards, there were 1 or 2 cheerful knocks on the door, and then Chang Gan opened the door and let in a young man with 2 horns on his head, who seemed to be older than Chang Gan, only 14 or 15 years old. The eyes are round and bright, full of aura. He only probed in and swept in, then stopped his eyes on Zhang Jiayu, looked up and down, then blinked, and said, "Brother Fairy." Zhang Jiayu looked at the cute little deer, and heard Chang Gan's positive introduction, "This is my brother, the immortal living in seclusion in Zongnan Mountain. This is A Chu." A Chu stood in front of Zhang Jiayu, the double horns on his head were translucent, and the top was covered with faint red blood, which seemed to have not grown yet, as if it would hurt when touched. The underside of the calf has not been completely transformed, and it is still a pair of deer's hooves. "Brother Immortal." A Chu approached with bright eyes, as if he was much more courageous than Chang Gan. "You look so good, you look better than I thought." Zhang Jiayu stared at him for a moment, looked at the sincere expression on A Chu's face, was silent for a few breaths, and then said, "You want to practice in Zongnan Mountain?" A Chu nodded seriously and said, "I will serve my brother well." Zhang Jiayu said, "My cultivation base is completely ruined, I am weak, and I am not the head of the fairy gate of the past. If you are by my side, you may not get anything. As long as the immortal brother can occasionally instruct Aisha to practice." Xiaolu blinked and moved closer as if unintentionally. The long eyelashes were fully displayed in front of Zhang Ziliu's eyes, and the breath spread slowly and greedily. "Come here, all faces obedient." He behaved pretty well, and he was so pure that it was easy to deal with such a young demon like Chang Gan. But in Zhang Jialu's eyes, it was still unbelievable. But Zhang Ziliu didn't care about this, as if he could tolerate Wen Renai being his neighbor. His attitude towards many things is okay, and all good, which is enough to accommodate a deer demon who seems to have a purpose but doesn't seem to be harmful. Zhang Jiayu nodded, and was about to continue, when he looked up and saw Wen Renai pushing the door in. This demon still looks the same, the robe is dark black, the eyes gradually become dark purple, and the pattern on the corner of the clothes uses blood-colored lines, which is full of monsters. The smell of pines and cypresses passed by, and the air of conquest by swordsmen passed from the opponent's body. Wen Renai seemed to have just woken up not long after seeing him at night, so he took the hairbrush from Chang Gan's hand very casually, and touched Zhang Jialu's falling snow hair with his fingertips. The fingers were cold, with a faint chill. His movement was so smooth that even Lord Moshan himself was so nervous that he realized it later. After he clenched the other person's hair, he realized that this was the first time he had combed Zhang Jialu's hair. The words of the realm master suddenly disappeared without a trace, and his heart came alive with a beating, and there was a cowardly feeling that sounded very humiliating. "If you don't comb well, I'm afraid that you will not be disliked by your former rival. And what to do if it hurts him?" Wen Renai's movements were faster than his mind, although his mind was messed up and even a little ridiculous, the movements of his hands were not slow at all. Zhang Zhilau was worried for only 2 seconds, and his good neighbor tied his snow hair and used a hosta to pass through the silver crown. When Renai strengthened his Hansen ability, looked up at the deer demon, and asked, "Who is this?" "Come to find the little demon that I took in," Zhang Zhilau said. After the hosta was over the crown, the lingering chill became heavier. When Renai leaned his head closer and whispered, "What about me? Don't take me in yet." The breath and the smell of pine and cypress spread over him when he spoke, making the tip of his ear warm. Zhang Zhilau stretched out his hand and rubbed his ears, pointed to Wen Renai next to him, and calmly said to Chu, "Girls must be careful when they go out. Those who wear black clothes are usually bad people. This is just a joke, but compared to demons, he has always been less fond of people from the demon world, as everyone knows. When Renai cooperated especially, it's a bad guy." Chu was stunned for a moment, reached out and touched his horn, and said, but I'm a male deer." Zhang Zhilau lowered his head and drank tea slowly, stretched out his hand and pulled out the book that he had not read last night, and said casually, "Boys should be careful, some bad guys like boys. The speaker is not intentional, the listener is intentional, a certain bad guy has a thought, and can't help but look at the boy he likes." Chu was stunned, and nodded as if he didn't understand. Then I leaned over to see what book Zhang Ziliu was reading, and saw the words 7 brothers and 1 sister, give me love to death. His mind suddenly got stuck, and he murmured, "Could it be that the world of self-cultivation do you also have a hobby of reading secular books?" Zhang Zhilau didn't cover it, flipped a page and said, "Have you read this kind of reading too?" Before Chu could answer, when Renai listened more and more, the more wrong he heard, he took out half of the book from Zhang Ziliu's hand, first glanced at the content, froze for a moment, and then turned to the cover. The cover reads the 5 words Xiandao with spiritual art. When Renai moved for a while, thinking of what complete talismans and spiritual cultivation he had seen Zhang Ziliu read in the past few days. He handed the book back to the other party and raised his eyebrows. "What are you looking at? Why are they all so full of content? Shouldn't the folklore book be a fairy tale book?" Zhang Zhilau glanced at him and said lightly, "What immortal Taoist book, this is the cover of my bag." When Ren Yi's eyebrows wrinkled, "What are you doing with this?" "Naturally, it's for reading." Zhang Zhilau looked at him strangely, as if he was saying something for granted. The covers of these folklore books are very direct and explicit. When the disciples saw it, wouldn't it make the young disciples curious and delay their cultivation? Zhang Zhilau said it was too calm and normal, as if he didn't think there was anything wrong with his careful consideration. When Ren Ye was stuck for a while and didn't know what to say. Then he heard Zhang Ziliu say in a calm and authentic tone, "Afternoon, I will go to the hot spring to take a bath. Please take care of the neighbors to take care of Chu and Chang Gan." When Renai stared at his thin body, and said in a ghostly way, "Good neighbor thinks that you should be taken care of, it seems that you can fall down when pushed." "A push and a fall?" Zhang Zhilau glanced down at himself and said casually, "If I fall, I won't get up, and I will corrupt you thousands of spiritual jades in the devil world." He was just joking, but he didn't expect to meet a pair of dark purple eyes at the next moment, staring at him directly and persistently, as if he was really interested. "Is it enough to have 10,000 Lingyu?" Zhang Zhilau was stunned for a moment, feeling that he was too close. He lowered his head and covered his lips and coughed lightly to hide the slightly unusual temperature on the back of his hand when the other's breath entangled. "You can also believe the joke." His voice has always been cold, and it is only in a few occasional jokes that people feel relaxed and gentle. But at this time, his whole person is no longer tense. This relaxed attitude is more than 10 million times more peaceful than Zhang Zhilau, who held the sword in the sky. This demon didn't retreat but moved forward, feeling the cold and lonely cold on the other side, as if suppressing the scorching heat all over his body. But when Renai still got closer, and said in a low voice, "You said I believe it. There are several hot springs behind Zongnan Mountain, which are almost never used due to the lack of people on the mountain. But when Renai sorted it out before Zhang Jialiu took off his robe, only a thin shirt that was close to his body was not taken off, and immersed in the pool to explore his body. Although he didn't have the slightest cultivation base, he was still in his realm, and he could look inside. At this moment, he looked inside his body. The more he looked, the more he felt that his meridians were shattered very willfully. It can be said to be appalling and irregular. When repairing the boundary membrane, it has to face a huge impact. He went to repair it alone. Originally, Ling Xiao and everyone should be assisted in formation, but Zhu Yuxin was afraid of leaking the news, and there was a sneak attack from evil sects, so he was the only one left to assist in the end. Zhang Jialiu was dizzy due to the heat, and closed his eyes as he recalled. This is the opportunity he left to Zhu Yuxin, and it is also the choice of the younger brother. The other party didn't do his best, which caused him to have grey hair overnight and was seriously injured, but this was the most acceptable result for Zhang Ziliu. He opened his eyes slightly, looked at the back of his hand against the faint light, and stared at the thin sword cocoon between his fingertips. This practitioner's hand, which was worn out and bleed during practice, and then rubbed against the cocoon, was so pale and colorless. Time. He suddenly remembered when Zhu Yuxin was a child, when he had just entered the door of his mentor, because he was an orphan who was brought back, and his cultivation was the hardest. He is a wild breed with no father and no mother. Zhu Yuxin is only 4 years old, only a little tall, but he rushed out like a terribly fierce kitten, protecting him behind him. He remembers Yuxin raising his little hand, holding his cheek and saying seriously, "Brother Jialiu, don't be afraid of them, Yuxin protects you." The milky voice was so milky that he didn't even know what to say. Later, it was Zhang Ziliu who protected him for half his life, until Zhu Yuxin chose to give up and no longer needed him. From the day that Zhu Wenyuan passed away, Zhu Yuxin only had senior brother in his mouth, and there was no longer the word brother. Zhang Jialiu only thought of this, and did not recall anything else. There are too many difficult things in his mind in practice, but as long as things can be overcome, they can't be called difficult. The heat of the hot spring was getting stronger. The snow-colored thin coat on his body was soaked wet, sticking to the frost-white back, and the water droplets slid down the spine line. Zhang Jialiu's natural spiritual body has no filth, so it didn't need to be cleaned. But he was used to bathing, and always felt that it was more comfortable. It's just that the spring water in Zongnan Mountain was hot, and he was also a little weak, and then he was sleepy, and his mind was a little dizzy. Until an aura with a strong sense of presence appeared from the side. Zhang Jialiu reluctantly raised his eyes, saw a black corner of his clothes, and touched his cuff with his wet fingertips. His voice was very soft, "Are you really following?" When Renai didn't speak, but held his wrist and injected a burst of purified spiritual power into it, as if this would relieve Zhang Ziliu's body discomfort. Using the demon body as a relay to purify the spiritual energy, "Do you feel pain?" Zhang Jialiu reacted a little sluggishly, then withdrew his hand and said, "What's wrong with letting the young master abuse him? There is a conflict between demonic energy and spiritual energy. He is a demon. He wants to instill spiritual energy in Zhang Jialiu. He can only use his body as a transfer station to extract and purify it between heaven and earth. Naturally, he will feel pain. This is really not a comfort thing." Zhang Jialiu retracted his fingers, pressed his chin on the back of his hand, closed his eyes, and said, "I don't want to owe favors, you have done enough. Since you don't want to owe a debt," when Renai whispered, "then treat me patiently and give me a healthy Zhang Ziliu. I haven't played against you again, and I won't be able to tell the difference with you." Relentless. Zhang Jialiu was silent for a moment, then said in a low voice, "It's hard for me again." His fingers were soaked in the warm pool water for a long time, and when they were covered by Wen Renai's fingers, they still revealed a coolness. This cold feeling radiated from the inside out, his heart, and even his body, were icy cold. This time, even if I owe favor, I won't pay it back. Zhang Jialiu said, you will suffer. Then you will suffer. Wen Renai stared at him, stretched out his hand and put a pill into the pool water. Other medicinal pills are strong, you are as crisp as a piece of paper now, try this. The pills entered the warm water, spread quickly, and melted into the hot spring. The pills penetrated into the warm pool water and melted in the water in an instant. Zhang Jialiu noticed what he was doing, but did not feel the medicinal power immediately, but asked, what is this? I found it from the demon world. Wen Renai said, it's the Jade Soul Cultivation Pill. This name is well known even in the world of self-cultivation. It is one of the few elixir in the demon world. However, unlike the effects of other tigers and wolves, the Jade Soul Cultivation Pill has a moderate effect and is very slow to take effect. It needs to be used for a long time and slowly warmed up. For extremely weak patients, it is necessary to soak in a medicated bath first and not take it directly. But compared to other elixir, it requires slow and long-term use without leaving any side effects. Its output is scarce and precious, and it seems that only the token of the demon lord can be obtained. These are all rumors from the cultivation world, and there is no way to verify their authenticity. But Zhang Jialiu still thought for a moment and asked, does your father know that you took this thing to heal me? Zhang Ziliu's concept of time is really unclear. In his eyes, Wen Renai still looks like he is looking at the younger generation, and the news of the new master of the demon world was only transmitted to the quartet when Zhang Ziliu repaired the boundary membrane. I feel that the person in front of me is just the young master of the devil world. Wen Renai didn't think of his thoughts, and asked instead, what about you, doctor? Zhang Jialiu said, I'm afraid I won't be killed when I hear people. There won't be any extra kindness to heal me. On the contrary, you're still young, and you act with your spirit. Men can't be small. Just when Wen Renai frowned and tried to refute, Zhang Jialiu coughed twice, he immediately forgot the words, and stared at him without blinking. The water temperature gradually rose, and the medicinal effect washed away the broken body along the liquid, with a slightly tingling feeling. Zhang Jialiu just coughed twice at first, but the pain in his chest became more and more uncontrollable. He frowned, his choking became louder, and his thin, pale lips were stained with blood. The ends of his hair were wet and fell into the hot spring, swirling slowly in the water. The eyelashes are snow white, almost translucent under the sun. The whole person seems to have no color, only the dark and quiet eyes, and the dazzling bright red on the lips. Wen Renai's heart jumped suddenly, he immediately reached out to support his arm, and said urgently, can't stand it. I'll bring you up. Before he could finish his words, he held his hand and heard Zhang Ziliu's low words. No. Wen Renai's movements immediately froze. He felt that the palm of his hand was wet, the fingertips were soft, and the thin calluses on one side of the knuckle slipped across his palm inadvertently, like a soft prickly cat's tongue licking it. Now his heart started to pound again. For the brief moment that Zhang Jialiu held him, the deer in Lord Moshen's heart smashed to death several times. The other party's body was wet, and even his hair was still wet. Wen Renai felt that his demonic heart did not care about his own wishes at all, and his crazy temptation and violent displays of love made him lose face at all. Zhang Jialiu didn't seem to notice, he raised his finger to wipe off the blood on his lips, and his thin shoulder slid down a little, almost falling into Wen Renai's arms. His body was cold, and only the area outside with the pool water radiated heat. This withered and fragile body, with almost no vitality, slowly fell down. The more Zhang Jialiu coughed, the looser the blood accumulated in the body. He clenched Wen Renai's sleeve tightly, lowered his head and spat out a mouthful of blood. Bloodstains fell on the ground beside the hot spring, smeared into dark red traces. Later, Zhang Jialiu tugged at his sleeve, closed his eyes for a while, and then said softly, "It's okay, it's a good thing to spit out blood." Cough. Wen Renai seemed to be dealing with a bubble that would burst when he was poked. He didn't dare to move, and even breathed very lightly. After hearing this, he tentatively raised his finger to wipe off the redness from the corner of his lips, and slowly, "Is it really okay?" "A little." Zhang Jialiu said, "I'm running out of strength." Wen Renai was stunned for a moment, and something flashed across his mind. He paused for a while, then stretched out his hand to carry the other party out of the hot spring, then took off his cloak to cover it so that no wind could penetrate, and then stood up and walked towards the pinewood building. It's a test of willpower. Every place where Zhang Jialiu was touched seemed to be hot, with a wonderful and special temperature. He hid those young loves carefully, and made countless excuses, but when he met the other party, he realized that these excuses were useless at all. No matter what the other person is doing, he likes it very much. Zhang Jialiu just had no strength, and it wasn't that the effect of the drug made his mind confused. He noticed the other party's abnormal heartbeat almost instantly, but Zhang Jialiu did not study the demons and was not familiar with the heart rate of this species. Calmly calculating. More than 300 beats per minute. He has no experience in love, so he can't tell from Wen Renai's performance, but he can see the magic lines on his neck. The magic pattern spreads upward from the bottom of the clothes, which seems to be Wen Renai's magic shape. It is said that the magic shape is displayed uncontrollably when the emotional changes are relatively severe. Zhang Jialiu looked at the demon with dramatic changes in mood, and then carefully thought about the other party's purpose, and vaguely understood what it was. But before he could think deeply, he heard Wen Renai's low voice. "I'm a little bit mad about it." The other party was unexpectedly candid. Zhang Jialiu glanced at him and said, "There are many people who have bad intentions against me." Wen Renai was suddenly choked by this sentence, and violent anger suddenly surged up. "It's all courting death. Some wanted to kill me to take the first seat, and some wanted me to leave the stage early to make way. Others, and some only had friendship with me on the surface. My confidant is a big trouble, young master, which one are you?" He asked too peacefully and lightly, and slowly suppressed Wen Renai's violent and murderous intentions. Lord Moshan was silent for a moment, then muttered, "Neither." Wen Renai closed the upstairs door, put the other party back on the soft couch, and after drying his half-wet hair and thin shirt, he still insisted on wrapping the cloak around him, and by the way lit the stove beside him. "What does it feel like?" Wen Renai asked, pressing his wrist to go in. Although the blood in the body has melted, the meridians are still broken with individuality, and they are tangled in a mess, like a ball of wool that has been played with by a cat master. Right now, the ill cat owner in front of him was tightening his collar, too sleepy to open his eyes, and said in a slow tone, "Except for the pain, I don't feel anything." The ever-drying prototype is coiled around the unlit candlestick. Xiaoluaxia didn't seem to be there, and it was quiet upstairs. Zhang Jialiu's voice was very low, like a breeze that dissipated after blowing over. Wen Renai was so nervous when he heard it, he couldn't help but get closer and asked him almost to the tip of his nose, "Are you blaming me? You don't really want to make an assertion." He didn't want to get better, his last wish was to come and go freely in this world. Zhang Jialiu was first dizzy by the steam of the hot spring, and then stimulated by the medicinal effects. At this moment, when the sleepiness was rising, he slowly blinked his eyes twice, and seemed to wake up a little, and said, "Don't want what?" Wen Renai looked at him, speechless. "You seem to have made an assertion and appeared by my side," Zhang Jialiu said. He was so sleepy that he added vaguely, "But that's okay, I'm used to accepting the status quo. It's like accepting the death of his teacher more than 1,000 years ago, accepting all the mess of the Ling Xiao faction, and even the decay and division of the entire immortal sect. Or, for example, accepting the gradual changes of his junior and junior brothers, the calculation of his friend Mianli hiding a needle, and the occasional embarrassment of heaven, accepting the life and death, good and evil of the people around him, and himself, from the body to the mood, increasingly tired and declining. When the spring breeze does not come, the willow branches wither. Who can count the ups and downs of the world? Zhang Jilayu rubbed forward slowly, closed his eyes and whispered, "Good neighbor. Thank you." When Renai stared at him dazedly, without a sound for a long time, he stretched out his hand, trying to fiddle with the other's falling white hair, but the moment before he touched it, he even retracted the action. None of the people cherished by the other party does not put their interests first, and so does Zhu Wuxin and Lai Zhen. No one is worth making Zhang Ziliu suffer. I slept from late afternoon to early morning. The morning light was still weak, the night was thick, and the candles seemed to be always dry. Xiaoluaxia came back and boiled some medicine, but Zhang Ziliu never woke up, and the medicine was cold. Zhang Jilayu reluctantly woke up, but the sleepiness did not disappear. When he opened his eyes, he saw his good neighbor holding his hand, and his eyes immediately shifted. "Zhang Jilayu, aren't you going to sleep?" The other party's eyes twinkled, his spirit was terrifying, and his purple eyes glowed, "Not sleepy." Zhang Jilayu looked at him for a while and said, "Sleeping is one of life's great joys." When Renai hesitated for a moment, "Which one do you mean sleeping?" Zhang Jilayu couldn't react for a while, was stunned, and said with a smile, "The one you think, come or not." This time, his good neighbor couldn't react. Zhang Jilayu picked up the cold medicine bowl and drank a little when he heard Wen Renai's hesitant voice. "Really?" Zhang Jilayu raised his eyebrows and put down the medicine bowl after drinking half of it, as if planning to see what the other party wanted to do. Afterwards, Lord Moshan nervously took off his robe, leaned over and lay beside Zhang Ziliu, pulled him into his arms and hugged him, satisfied, "Okay. Zhang Jilayu, young Zunzu's heart is not right, it's really high and level." Of course. When Renai wanted to kiss him, but he restrained himself and whispered, "It's still early before dawn, it's the coldest time, you hug me, I'm hot." Zhang Jilayu said, "Got it, little stove." He was still sleepy, so he simply went back to sleep, and before going to bed, he raised his eyes to look at this young and terrifying demon. It's unexpectedly thoughtful, unexpectedly childish, and unexpectedly endearing. It seems that the prejudice against the inferiority of the demons cannot be classified into every individual. His neighbor, so far, is really good. The room was quiet. After dawn, the residual warmth on the bed was still there, and Wen Renai seemed to have only left soon. Zhang Jilayu drank the medicine again and ate something, and then heard Chang Gan ask with a complicated and careful face, "Brother, your relationship with my little uncle, is that good?" Before Zhang Jilayu could answer, A Chu, who came downstairs, also came over, raised his dear head and said, "The immortal slept with him. I heard that sleeping together will give birth to new deer." "That's a male snake and a female snake." Chang Gan corrected, "Brother and little uncle are both male, they won't give birth to little snakes, nothing will happen to two big men together, right, brother?" Zhang Jilayu nodded while listening, thought for a while, and said casually while turning the teacup in his hand, "No, I can do everything, even having children." Chang Gan was stunned, "Ah." Zhenjun Suzaku only stayed in Zongnan Mountain for about a day. After confirming that Wen Renai did not intend to hurt his friends, Liejin returned to the demon world. The ancient trees were towering, the roots were intricately intertwined, and there was a violent vibration in the Wanling Palace. Qinglin was sitting on the seat, drinking tea while looking at the irritable vermilion bird in front of him, watching his flaming sword smash the ground fiercely, and the whole person exuded a very strong low pressure. "You just destroyed the Wanling Palace, what's the use?" Qinglin looked at him with his chin on his back, "If Jilayu hadn't been protecting you, your bones would have been broken by Wen Renai. Feed the dog. Thinking of you and me joining forces, it is impossible for me to be the enemy of the Lord of the Demon Realm for this kind of thing." She watched Lai Zhen's long bright red hair lose its luster, and the phoenix feathers on her body also hung down. The sword on the ground was inserted into a crack, and the cold light above the blade was no longer there, and the whole person perfectly interpreted the phrase, "A phoenix with feathers is not as good as a chicken." Qinglin glanced at him and said, "You and I join forces? Going to kill a half-step Jinxian? It's crazy. When Zhelu is around, although you and I are better than him on the bright side, it's just a discussion. Often if the point is reached, if it is really a life and death struggle, let the devil stew the soup, maybe. How can he be so strong? He has." Qinglin cut off his words ruthlessly, looked at the back of true monarch Suzaku and said, "When Renjian is also a half-step Jinxian, why did he hand over power to his son so easily? I tell you, Wen Renai is the strongest person in the entire demon world." Li Zhen was full of anger and was aroused again. The flames all over his body suddenly burst, and the temperature soared. Can he be stronger than Zhelu? Zhelu is the best in the world this time. Without Qinglin cutting off his words, Liejin had already stopped abruptly, stopped in a daze, and looked at the ancient trees and vines that were entangled not far away. Zhangjialiu has no cultivation base. The rays of the sun have dyed the clouds and leaked in between the branches and leaves of the ancient trees, like the remains of wet blood. The Wanling Palace was silent for a long time. Qinglin stood up and saw the hot tears that were almost burning with white smoke on the ground. "When you and I chose to stand by and watch, we should have expected today." Qinglin walked up to him and saw Feng Yu behind his ear trembling slightly, and knew that his companion must be complicated and hard to say, but my friend is right. The world of comprehension is so exhausted, only in exchange for the never-ending support of the right path. By doing this, we not only pave the way for the demon world and remove obstacles, but also let Zhelu get rid of the status quo of just paying. Qinglin paused for a while, then said again, "I just didn't expect that he would be injured so badly. Could it be that the Ling Xiao faction doesn't even know how to help with the formation?" These words are just excuses, but excuses also need to have one. Liejin's thoughts on his friends are very complicated. In addition to these excuses, there is also a vague part of the reason. Broken high mountain flowers have the opportunity for people to pick them. He kept calling Zhang Ziliu a friend, but in his heart, he did not consider him a real friend. Seeing that he didn't speak, Qinglin walked around the true monarch Suzaku for a few weeks and said, "I will advise you, Zheliu doesn't like demons. Don't worry, Wen Renai is at best one of those delusional people. It's just a more capable one, and it's no different from your essence." She directly said that the other party was delusional, then picked up the teacup to moisten her throat, and leaned against the table. "He didn't let Wen Renai kill you, isn't it enough to show your advantage?" Qinglin persuaded him for a long time before he heard Li Zhen's dull and uncertain voice, "I seem to regret it." Qinglin clenched his teacup tightly. "I'm not at all, for his own good. I know." Qinglin said, "In your heart, you just want to get him. In fact, many people think so. Zhu Yuxin, Jin Yujia, Wen Renai. Your advantage is that you are more awake than them, closer to him." Her words pierced reality, just like a thin needle pierced an inflated balloon, and everything filled in it ran out as if deflated, leaving only the shriveled skin filled with desire. Qinglin didn't say any more, but looked into the distance and added silently in his heart, "But he won't like you." From a long time ago, Qinglin realized that Zhang Zhiliu hardly lived for himself. He was precise and fair, like a ruler marked by a scale. In his eyes, there was only grace and righteousness, and only the overall situation was the most important. Sometimes when she was joking with Zhang Ziliu, she could see a trace of deep exhaustion from the small smile on the other's lips. He doesn't like someone like Liejin who needs to be motivated to deal with it, but he is still habitually protecting his friends. At the same time, Zongnan Mountain. Jin Yujia rubbed his hands together and asked the monk beside him, "Are you sure that Zhenjun Suzaku came here a few days ago? That's still fake? Oh my young pavilion master, the whole sky is half dyed red, and even the snow has melted a few inches. Who else is it if it's not true monarch Suzaku? True monarch Suzaku and Zhang Xianzun are the best friends." The 1,000 years of peace between the world of self-cultivation and the demon world started between the two. Now that such a big event has happened to Xian Zunjiang, Suzaku will not go to the Ling Xiao faction, looking for Zhu Yuxin, but came here instead. Isn't the meaning of it obvious? True Lord Suzaku didn't take anyone away. Yet, I don't know if the talk broke down, or what happened. Zhenjun Suzaku stayed on the mountain for more than a day. When I saw it later, it seemed that he was injured alone. Jin Yujin nodded and asked again, "Who else did you tell this besides me?" The monk replied quickly, "I saw it the other day, so I quickly told you." No one said anything. The entire cultivation world is looking for Zhang Jiayu, and there are secret rewards for news everywhere, but the Wushuan Jianj is the most expensive. Jin Yujin nodded slightly, glanced at him, and said, "Okay, you wait at the foot of the mountain, prepare the carriage, stove and medicinal pills for me. As long as I find someone, I will take the senior strictly and smoothly. Don't give those prodigal sons a chance to take advantage." The cultivator was stunned for a moment, then murmured, "Aren't you a Deng Chilang?" Before he could finish his words, Jin Yuja slapped his head, "What are you talking about? How many people are so greedy for those who have lost their wishes? If I don't protect the seniors will be bullied. What should I do? Go and do your business." After Jin Yuja said this, he couldn't help rubbing his hands again. He is dressed in a robe of swordsmanship, white inside and gold outside, and a black belt. His clothes are gorgeous and delicate, and even the hair crown is made of unparalleled lingyu, and there is a smart and clear expectation in his eyes. Different from the confrontation with Zhu Yuxin in Ling Xiao school that day, Jin Yuja at this moment is like a hairy boy who has come back for a blind date. His youthful childishness and the feeling of seeing his first love are overflowing. Carrying the Sevayen star sword on his back, he went up the mountain from the snowy path of Zongnan Mountain, past an empty bamboo garden, and saw the adjacent pinewood building. There seemed to be people living in the small building. There was a deer demon sitting at the door outside, with tender horns that could pinch out water. Boys and girls looked like they were decocting medicine boredly. Jin Yujin knew that the senior often took in the little demon, and it must be the same now. He was not surprised, but leaned over and asked in a good voice, "Xiaolu, does Zhang Xianzun live here?" A Chu rolled his eyes and circled around him, as if he could see something. "Yet, are you here to take advantage of the fire?" Jin Yuja's smile froze, "Take advantage of the fire? Or else I'll fall into trouble." A Chu said disdainfully, "When the protagonist is not down, all of them are respectful descendants, confidants, friends and caring juniors. When the protagonist is injured, each of them thinks that they are the rescuers in third-rate novels. The hero of the domineering president in the water and fire warms the heart of the heroine like a god, and I don't even look at the status of my immortal brother. Would you rather be worthy?" Jin Yuja completely stunned the Ziyuan deer, and before he could understand what the other party meant, he was snorted by A Chu and scolded, "I have to hate because of love, good guy, it's something that is related to people. You don't do anything at all." It was the first time that Aisha saw these people described in the novel. As soon as he walked in, he tried his best to fool Chang Gan and found Zhang Zilia with great effort. He slammed out of the room, turned around and entered the room after speaking, and closed the door with a slam. A Chu closed the door and entered the house, and immediately turned into an ignorant sweet little deer, and put the fried medicine beside Zhang Ziliu. Zhang Ziliu was always attentive when he was reading. Although he heard a few conversations, all of them were just passing by, and nothing entered his mind. At this moment, he looked up at A Chu and said, "Who is outside?" Xiaolu said, "Dengtib prodigal son." Zhang Ziliu nodded first, then heard something wrong, raised his eyebrows slightly, and looked back. "What prodigal sons, all came here. It snows for half a year in Zongnan Mountain. It is deserted, uninhabited, and full of strange creatures. It is not even worth sightseeing." Aisha looked at his nose and heart, and insisted, "Not a good person. Judging from the parts he has seen, Jinyuja is definitely not among the good people in the original work. In the early stage, he showed his coveting heart for the protagonist, and even showed signs of love and hatred. Fortunately, he knew that this cultivator has no CP novel, the beautiful brother is very noble, these toads and toads are not worthy. But when Rinai was the one who secretly knocked it under the text. It shouldn't be in the way. Just when Achu was thinking about the plot and insisting that Jinyuja was not a good person, the door of the Pinewood building was knocked very well. 3 short and 1 long, very educated. After the sound, the door was gently pushed open. It is rare to find such a normal person entering the door. Zhang Ziliu thought calmly. He watched the junior in a golden robe step forward, his eyes glowing at him, and then he half knelt down and saluted him. Senior suffered. Zhang Ziliu looked at himself and felt that he didn't suffer much. Would you like to go to the Wushuan Jianj? I have packed the room, carriages, and horses for the seniors. As soon as you arrive, you will immediately be enshrined by the Supreme Master of the Wushuan Jianj. My father can't sleep and eat because of the whereabouts of the seniors, for fear of uneasy and kind people. What do I do to the senior? I too. I have always been worried. The more he talked, the more nervous he became. His eyes swept across at first, then moved up from the corner of Zhang Ziliu's snow-white shirt, and moved up gradually until he saw his face. Jinyuja was stunned. Even though he had long known that the senior was injured, he had never imagined it in his mind. When Zhang Ziliu rescued him at the beginning, with just one sword, he swept away thousands of evil spirits that climbed out of the netherworld, and brought him back, the child who sank into the Styx River. Otherwise, Jinyuja should have become the satiety food for evil spirits at that time, and there would be no such thing as today. He and Zhang Ziliu do not have the name of master and apprentice, but they have the reality of master and apprentice. He often lived in the Ling Xiao school and practiced with Zhu Wuxin. He still remembered Zhang Ziliu's body temperature and breath when he corrected his sword-holding posture. In the cold, there was a hint of gentleness. Therefore, although he scolded Zhu Wuxin, although he was infinitely worried, in his heart, he had the same concept as Zhu Wuxin all along. He couldn't believe that there was anything in this world that Zhang Ziliu couldn't do. Until he saw the person in front of him, Suyi and Snow Cloak, with withered white hair, he looked over calmly. Jinyuja's admiration, longing, secret love and admiration all seemed to have swelled to the limit, and then suddenly burst open, the fragments crumpled together in his heart, twisted together, and the pain made him speechless. Senior. Zhang Ziliu nodded, Chuan Dang responded to this title, and then said, Yuja, tell the pavilion master that I am not in good health, so I won't go. Jinyuja had a hard throat and nodded vigorously, then I'll stay and take care of you. Before he could finish his sentence, he saw Zhang Ziliu frown slightly. His heart jumped up immediately, fearing that the senior would be displeased by this sentence. Just when he was nervously beating his heart to his throat, he heard the other party speak gently. Is the usual thing solved? Jinyuja was stunned for a moment, and then he was dizzy by the shocking demonic energy behind him. In the next instant, a semi-demonized hand came up from the back of his neck and held it, and the bone spur could pass through his throat almost in the next moment. Carried him like a pendant, and moved him away. Well, no one will hunt him down anymore. When Rinai answered his sweetheart first, then turned his purple eyes slightly, and glanced at Jinyuja, his eyes were dark and unfathomable, which implied a dangerous and mysterious smile and murderous intent. You're in the way. The atmosphere was a little urgent for a while. When Rinai loosened his collar with one hand, and untied the bright red and dazzling cloak, and the snowflakes on it disappeared with a flick, and hung up as usual. Who is this? When Rinai asked. Zhang Ziliu glanced at him and said, the young pavilion master of Wushuan Jianj, my junior. This demon seems to be normal, but the hostility on his body is almost overflowing, and he is digging into his neck and collar all the time, tying his spine, making people feel cold all over. Jin Yuja vaguely felt that he had guessed the reason why Sozaku Genjun failed to take Senior Zhang away. This person took advantage of the situation and took the senior hostage. Jin Yuja was in a cold sweat. He didn't go to see this demon. His mind was full of strange plots that he didn't know how to make up. Zhang Jialiu waved his hand and said to the young man who was growing up in front of him, "Come here." Jin Yuja clenched his fists, almost making a mark on his palm, hating his incompetence deeply. He let out a long breath, and walked to Zhang Zilia behind his back. "Since you know that I'm here," Zhang Jialiu said while thinking, "don't look for it anymore, I'm all right." Jin Yuja nodded with difficulty, his eyes were vague and uncertain, and he didn't know if he really remembered this sentence. "The others are too. The road is long and the road is long, and you have an infinite future, so you should take the responsibility." Zhang Jialiu's tone was light, and there was a familiar ice and snow-like breath on his body. Like the wind and snow in Zongnan Mountain, the chill poured into the heart, making people sober too much. Zhang Jialiu stretched out his hand, just like many years ago, he touched the top of his hair peacefully, but only touched the other party's cold hair crown. He withdrew his hand and said softly, "I won't say goodbye to you, just go back." Jin Yuja stood there in a daze, grabbed the corner of his shirt when the other party pulled his hand back, and blurted out, "Senior." Zhang Zilia looked at him silently. "Senior, actually, I am to you." These words have been rehearsed many times, and they have been played out in his mind countless times, and each time it makes people emotional, but in front of the other party, he can't say a word. Like a sharp knife stuck in the throat, in the process of brewing, it began to be difficult to speak and began to feel embarrassed. He gritted his teeth, and after a while he said, "Can you relax your gender requirements a little bit?" Zhang Jialiu, gender requirements? Jin Yuja held the sight that could almost eat him alive, and said bravely, "That's it." He looked at the deer behind him, and said against his will, "A request for shelter." Zhang Jialiu pulled back his cuffs and said indifferently, "Are you homeless?" When he spoke in this tone, he was on the verge of anger. Jin Yuja didn't dare to touch him again, but his eyes kept falling on the ends of his hair hanging from his shoulders. He suddenly felt that this elder, who had made him wishful thinking for many years, no longer had the tenacity and sharpness of the past, but was like a handful of snow that could not be melted, and would disappear completely at some point in time. Lose. Just when he was speechless, he clearly felt the sound of the devil twisting his bones beside him. Jin Yuja's hair stood on end, and before he could react, a wisp of cold wind rushed past his ears, and blood was drawn against his cheek. When the blood stains left half an inch, he realized that it was a dagger. The dagger grazed his cheek, cutting off a trace of long black hair, and the cold wind swept the back of his head, nailing something dull. Not far behind him, the dark purple magic dagger cut off a piece of fiery red ear feathers, and it was only a millimeter away, and it could pierce Liejin's eyes. This vermilion bird did not know when it came, as if it had just arrived, and it seemed to have stayed outside the window for a long time. True monarch Sozaku faded his prototype and turned into a human appearance. He bent down and picked up the piece of ear feathers that had been cut off from the ground, turned through the window with one hand, and glanced at the few people in the room, but his eyes did not stop at Jin Yuja, but went straight to the friend's side. Jalou. Liejin took out a small jade bottle, which was the body protection spirit of the demon world. "I went back and got something, it should be useful to you." Liejin's body was covered in dazzling red gold. He raised his flaming eyes and glanced at Wen Rinai. He didn't say anything to the dagger just now, and turned to hold Zhang Ziliu's wrist. Wen Rinai immediately felt that he was prepared. "I was wrong in the past." Liejin looked at him and said, "But I will make it up to you. Don't ignore me." Before he could finish his words, Zhang Jialiu moved his hand away, lowered his head and continued to drink the medicine until he drank all the bitter soup and medicine, without even looking at the body-protecting spirit on the table. He put down the porcelain bowl and said calmly, "You talk a lot. Lai was really stunned. You too? Zhang Jialiu glanced at Jin Yuja, his tone was as cold as ice. You are very noisy. There was silence in the room, and the fire went on and off. Just when the silence was so stagnant that it made it hard to breathe, Lai Zhen's unbelievable voice came. Zhalu, do you really want to see me? Can't you forgive me once? I actually... Roll. His voice stopped abruptly. Kinglin taught him to bring the body protection spirit due, so when Renai had no reason to stop him, taught him to admit his mistakes, apologize earnestly, and let the other party remember the past affection, but did not teach him how to face the current situation. The flame in Liejin's eyes was almost extinguished, and the temperature of his body was lowered to an unprecedented level. He didn't have the feeling of realization before, and it was only at this moment that he realized with great weight what he had lost. On the contrary, Jin Yuja was extremely obedient, bowed and saluted without saying a word, and exited the pinewood building. Liejin's whole bird froze there, as if it wouldn't move even if there was a thunderstorm. After a while, he seemed to have recovered a little bit of God and left silently. Zhang Ziliu was still reading in the same place, and after drinking the medicine, he wrote on the paper. The pen, ink, paper, and ink's tone were sent by Wen Renai, and they were all fine products, but they exuded a magical energy that could not be ignored, making Zhang Ziliu somewhat uncomfortable. As he wrote, he discussed with Xiaolu Aishu what to plant in front of the building. The two chatted for a while, and Aishu asked in a low voice and trembling, Brother Shenxian, how do you know they will listen to you? Zhang Jialiu lowered his eyebrows to write, and involuntarily followed him and lowered his voice. The friends I made, the younger generation I helped, can't be called a gentleman, but they're not a beast. That's because you didn't count their crush. Aishu whispered quietly. By the way, what about Chang? Ah Chu said, he went down the mountain to buy wine for his brother. The medicinal wine, the kind made with scorpions, is used to treat rheumatism. I don't have rheumatism. Zhang Jialiu said. But brother doesn't always have headaches, he also cures headaches. A Chu blinked at him, his eyes full of gratification. Zhang Jialiu could see a little bit of purpose in him, but getting along gradually, knowing that Xiaolu has a good heart, he didn't say anything. Folk medicinal wines were of no use to his body, but because of their weak medicinal effects, they became safer and easier to try. Just as the two were talking, Wen Renai, who was listening quietly, picked up the blood cloak, turned around and took a few steps out. Just as he was pushing the door, he suddenly heard Zhang Ziliu's voice. Wen Ren Yat. In normal times, he should be called Good Neighbor or Xiao Zunzu. He rarely goes by that full name. Wen Renai stopped and turned to look at him. Zhang Jialiu stopped writing and looked at him for a while, his eyes were pitch black, and no light could penetrate. He said slowly, Good neighbor, go out when you go out, don't kill people. Wen Renai's heart seemed to be slammed by something, and he felt that the other party could see through everything, and it seemed that he couldn't escape his eyes with any thought. But why can't you see through his? Zhang Jialiu paused for a moment, then smiled and said, You can't kill a bird either. I'll be disgusted by the smell of blood. Wen Renai looked at him silently. The anger in his heart was instantly extinguished, and the chill of the ice water fell to his face. He was easily pinched at his weakness, threatened by a short sentence, which made people feel cold all over. He didn't leave, but approached Zhang Jialiu, leaned over and bowed his head, the violent and unsettled hostility mixed with the cold air, he came to face. Why? Zhang Jialiu smiled, looked at the dark purple eyes, and said in a calm tone, It's not easy for the world to be at peace, please forgive me. Jin Yuja is his younger generation, his loyalty to the righteous path of Xianmen is obvious to all, his talent is outstanding, and his reputation is very good. Even if he does something wrong in the future, he will criticize and restrain him, and he will not make any big mistakes. And the relationship between Liejin and him has been in operation for thousands of years. Without him, the demon world would be in chaos and the world would be restless. Have you really put it down? When Renai licked his teeth, stared at him and said, you almost lost your life because of these 4 words. With the way you are now, you still have to worry about others, Zhang Zhe. Lu, you still need to worry about yourself first. Your meridians are leaking into a sieve, you can wake up in a dream 4 or 5 times a day, and you vomit more blood than you drink. His words stopped here. The other's fingers pressed against his lips, the body temperature was cold, but soft. Zhang Zhiyu didn't think he knew it, but he still didn't want to hear it. Instead, he said softly, according to the days I thought before, there will be a shooting star tonight. Would you like to watch it with me? When Renai didn't know what to say for a while. His throat seemed to be stuffed with ice cubes, and he didn't even have the slightest bit of suffocation. He could only slowly lean over to hug him, his head was lowered in a low mood, and he wanted to put pressure on his shoulders, but he didn't dare to exert any force. In the middle is the expectation of the meteor in his eyes when he said these words. His mood was unprecedentedly low, and he was afraid of crushing the other party, so he just hugged him lightly for a while, and replied in a deep voice,